Eddard Stark stood upon the battlements of Winterfell, gazing out over the stark landscape of the north as dawn's light began to creep across the horizon. The air was cold, brisk enough to set frost in his beard, and the old stones under his boots seemed to hold the chill of 1,000 winters. Even so, he felt a deeper, more unsettling cold stirring in his heart. The rider from the Night's Watch had brought a story that sounded like madness. White Walkers, the others, creatures out of tales, and a deserter, young, pale as milk, terrified beyond all hope, had repeated that same warning with trembling lips. By all the laws of the realm, Eddard should have executed that man swiftly, or turned him over to the Watch. Duty demanded it. The man was a deserter, after all. But something in his eyes, something in his voice, had unsettled Eddard Stark more than he cared to admit. He felt the frost on the wind sting the tips of his ears, but he scarcely noticed. As Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, he was intimately familiar with rumor and superstition, with fisherfolk's tall tales of sea monsters and peasant whispers of ghosts in the Wolfswood. But the deserter's story clung to him like a cold brand upon his memory. White Walkers, a legion of icy, inhuman shapes, and the dead rising to fight for them. It sounded outlandish, childish, yet the youth had spoken as one who had seen them. Every tremor in his voice had testified to terror beyond reason. Ned had seen men fearful of many things, the lash, the gallows, the sword, but that fear had been different, reaching a deeper place than the simple dread of death. On this morning, even the wind seemed to hiss of secrets best left unspoken. The north was quiet, but it wasn't the comforting hush he knew. Something had changed in the deep woods and the wide tundras that lay between Winterfell and the Wall. Some part of him recalled the crypts far below, and how the statues of his ancestors looked on with their stony eyes, their dire wolves at their feet, as though waiting for a day all the songs warned would come. Winter is coming, the Starks said for thousands of years, a motto that was more prophecy than promise. But how many truly believed that winter might bring more than just snow and ice? That perhaps it could bring horrors from the darkest corners of old bedtime stories? Ned swallowed, feeling the dryness in his throat. The words of the deserter still echoed. He had begged for mercy, not out of concern for his life, but out of desperation to be believed. They're real, the White Walkers. I swear, my lord, by the gods, I saw them. And then, when pressed, the details poured out. A swirl of cold, glowing blue eyes, men cut down in silence and rising again with a dead man's stare. Ned had wanted to dismiss it. He'd wanted to. Honor demanded that he not place too much trust in the words of a criminal who had abandoned his vows. Yet, as the weeks turned, the tale refused to leave him. He had found himself glancing toward the north with growing unease. His dreams had become peppered with fleeting images of pale shapes in the night. He was no boy. He'd seen battle, knew what fear could do to a man. But this fear was something else, something ancient. He recalled old Nan's stories from when he was young, a swirl of half-remembered legends about the long night, the others, the battles in the Age of Heroes. It was easy to dismiss them as fables told to children to hurry them to bed. But now, those whispered tales seemed to echo in his mind with strange resonance. Time pressed on, and then came the raven from King's Landing. Jon Arryn was dead. King Robert, Ned's old friend, needed a new hand. The letter was formal, yet personal, laden with the weight of a command and a plea at once. Come south, rule at my side, help me maintain the realm, it said in so many words. Ever since Robert's rebellion, Ned had known his duty to the king, but he also knew his duty to the north. Torn between the love for his friend and the obligations of the realm, Ned spent long days and nights pondering. He consulted Maester Luwin, spoke with Catelyn, and weighed every angle. Accepting Robert's invitation would mean leaving the north at a time when the seeds of danger might be stirring. Rejecting it would risk offending the king he owed so much. The decision should have been simple if not for the swirling fear inside his heart. He could not quiet that memory of the deserter's trembling voice. In Winterfell's Godswood, beneath the towering weirwood tree whose red leaves trembled in the breeze, Ned sought the old gods and found no comfort. He prayed for guidance. He prayed for a sign. Some nights he dreamed of Robert's face, full of laughter and wine, urging him to the south, to the bright, sunlit courtyards and glittering feasts of King's Landing. Other nights he woke in a cold sweat, the faint echo of a shriek in his mind, a swirl of snow in the blackness, and a pair of eyes glowing an impossible blue. One night, as the moon hung like a pale coin over Winterfell, Ned woke from a dream that shook him to the core. He had dreamed he stood upon the wall, the great ice structure looming beneath a sky full of shining stars. Ghostly shapes in white drifted across the desolate tundra beyond the gate. He could not see their faces, only their silhouettes against the moonlit snow. But as he stared, a wind whipped at him, and in that wind was a voice, faint but distinct. "They come." Then there was the metallic scraping of swords, the dreadful thunder of war drums that had no visible source. The shapes moved, and from behind them, others emerged, shapes that scarcely seemed real. They advanced upon the wall, unstoppable, silent, bringing with them a chill that threatened to freeze his very blood. He felt their presence pressing against the ancient ice. When he woke, the memory of that cold lingered in his bones. Shaken, Ned rose from his bed and stepped onto the balcony, the wind pushing at him like a silent warning. Winter was coming, but perhaps something worse than snow and ice came with it. He realized with clarity then that his duty as Warden of the North meant more than merely holding titles and paying heed to the king's commands. The old traditions and the old stories might be carrying truth. And if the White Walkers truly stirred, if the wall was threatened, what lord could abandon his seat in the face of that danger? Catelyn found him there, leaning on the rail, eyes gazing north. She asked if he was thinking of Robert's letter. Ned turned to her with a sober look. "I cannot go to King's Landing," he said, the realization rolling off his tongue as though it was being shaped by powers beyond him. "Not now. The North calls, Cat. Something is wrong. I can feel it, and I cannot abandon it. Robert will have to forgive me." She stared in surprise, for she knew how close Ned was to the king. She reminded him of obligations, of alliances, of the potential fury a rejection might cause. Still, she sensed a different fear in him, a fear not for himself but for the North and all its people. He pulled her close and whispered of the dream, of the warning he felt in his soul, as though the gods themselves had stirred an ancient chord in him. "I will send word to Robert that I cannot accept his offer," he said, half surprising himself with how it rang like the hammer on an anvil. "My place is here. If there is any truth to these rumors, I must protect the North. I must see to the safety of all those under my care." So it was that Ned wrote his response, a letter full of apology and unvarnished truth. He wrote of his concerns about rumors from beyond the wall, the potential threat stirring in the far north. He begged the king's understanding and asked for time, promising that once matters were secured in his own domain, he would answer Robert's call if he could. He sealed it with the dire wolf of House Stark and sent it by Raven, the weight of it leaving him with both relief and dread. He was turning away from his friend, and he wondered whether he was damning himself with this choice. The days that followed were uneasy. Robb, his eldest son, had just begun to settle into the rhythms of learning to rule Winterfell in the times Ned was away or preoccupied. Now, he would be tested sooner than anyone expected. For Ned intended to lead a vanguard to the wall, to speak with Lord Commander Jeor Mormont and see for himself what new darkness might be stirring. He summoned his knights and some of his most loyal bannermen. Word spread that Lord Stark would ride for the wall before the next moon's turn. In the courtyard, swords were sharpened, horses were readied, and the tension was palpable. Why would the Lord of Winterfell himself heed the rumors of a watch deserter? From the ramparts, Sansa and Arya watched their father prepare. Sansa looked troubled and asked if they were truly traveling north in the middle of approaching winter. Arya, eyes shining with fierce excitement, pressed her father to allow her to come. Ned stroked her hair softly. "Not this time, my brave wolf. This journey is fraught with unknown dangers." Arya tried to protest, but he gave her a stern glance. "You are not old enough, and I would not risk you for anything. If the gods are good, This will be but a simple trip, but it must be done. He tried to soften his words by promising to tell her all about it when he returned, but Arya's frustration was plain. Bran, too, looked at his father with wide eyes, still healing from his fall, though in this new timeline of events, the tension around his accident was overshadowed by other concerns. He asked if the old stories were true. Ned tried to reassure him, but found he could not bring himself to lie. All he could say was that the world was large and old, and that men should never dismiss the possibility of darkness lurking in forgotten corners. "But I will keep you and your brothers and sisters safe," Ned promised. "That is why I must go." As the time for departure neared, Ned could feel the threads of fate tightening around him. The raven from King's Landing came once more, bearing a letter that fairly burned with Robert's frustration. The king's message was urgent. Jon Arryn's death raises questions and threats to the realm. "I need you, Ned. Duty demands you come. This talk of White Walkers is madness." But Ned stood firm, penning a respectful reply. He prayed Robert would understand, or at least that their long friendship would endure. But a gnawing worry plagued him. If White Walkers truly stirred, if that threat was real, could the realm afford to ignore it? Would Robert realize, too late, that Ned's warnings were not the fantasies of fearful men? On the appointed dawn, Ned mounted his warhorse in the courtyard, flanked by a handful of trusted men. Jory Castle, stout as any northern oak. Roderick Castle, whose gray whiskers framed a firm mouth that had barked training commands to many young squires, and a score of knights sworn to Winterfell, each armed and provisioned for a journey that could be harsh and perilous. They wore cloaks lined with fur, as the cold this time of year could bite even the bravest. Behind them trailed a larger force of mounted men-at-arms, their numbers forming the Stark vanguard that would ride behind their lord up the King's Road to Castle Black. Atop the battlements, Robb stood with Theon Greyjoy and the younger Stark children, watching with anxious eyes. Catelyn was by Robb's side, her face a mixture of resignation and concern. As Ned locked eyes with her, she gave him a faint, sad smile, lifting her fingers in farewell. He swallowed the lump in his throat, turned his horse, and gave the signal. They rode out in the pale sunlight, the horse's breath steaming in the chill morning air. The great gates of Winterfell groaned as they swung open, releasing the party onto the wide, snowy fields beyond. The old walls disappeared behind them soon enough, swallowed by the gently rolling hills. The roads, though well-traveled, were quiet, for few ventured out so early in the year. Yet every league they traveled north, Ned felt an odd sense of foreboding. It was as though the land itself watched them pass, stony-faced and silent. The wind rustled the branches overhead, carrying faint echoes of crows' caws. The nights on the King's Road were black and cold, the skies often thick with clouds that threatened snow. They pressed on regardless, stopping to make camp where they could find shelter. The men gathered around fires, exchanging uneasy talk about the reason for their journey. Some scoffed at the idea of White Walkers, chalking up the rumor to the ravings of a mad deserter. Others, more superstitious, cast anxious glances into the darkness, remembering old tales told by grandmothers. Ned kept his own counsel. He did not claim to know the truth of it, only that he had to learn for himself what was happening at the wall. Had he but a single shred of proof that the threat was real, how could he forgive himself for ignoring it? On the fifth night of travel, as their fires crackled and the moon hung low, Ned found it difficult to sleep. He was plagued once again by disjointed visions. The face of his father, Rickard Stark, speaking words he couldn't quite hear. Images of snowdrifts stained red with blood, the sound of ice cracking underfoot. When he finally drifted off, he dreamed of a great wolf prowling through a blizzard, howling into a silence that swallowed all sound. When he woke, his breath caught as though he had just escaped a nightmare. Overhead, stars peeked out from thinning clouds, but they offered no comfort. They continued north, crossing the last river, passing silent villages whose occupants watched them with wide eyes. Closer to the wall, the King's Road was less traveled, and the dark shapes of the trees grew more foreboding. Above, storm clouds threatened, but only the occasional snow flurry dusted the road. In these untamed parts of the north, the land bore a certain hush that set men's nerves on edge. Ned felt it gnawing at him, an awareness of deep wilderness where wildlings roamed and darker things might stir. As they neared Molestown, the first settlement in the shadow of the wall, a scout returned at dusk, pale-faced, with news that made Ned's heart pound. The bodies of 2 Night's Watchmen had been found in a clearing just off the road. Both dead, faces frozen in horror. Their black cloaks were torn, and no sign of who or what killed them. Ned and a handful of men followed the scout to the scene. It was a grim sight. The clearing blanketed in snow, the 2 men laid out as though they'd fallen instantly, weapons barely drawn, eyes open and staring. Their skin had a grayish pallor, and the trees around them seemed eerily quiet. Even the wind stilled, as if holding its breath. Ned knelt beside one of the bodies, feeling the brittle cold of the man's flesh. There was a curious lack of blood. Roderick Castle, crossing himself in the sign of the 7, noted that there were no tracks leading away, just the men's own footprints leading to the spot. "It's as if whatever did this vanished into thin air," he muttered. The men exchanged apprehensive looks. Here was evidence that something was gravely amiss. The dreaded sense in Ned's heart deepened. He ordered the bodies to be wrapped and taken onward to Castle Black. Perhaps the maesters there could glean more. They pressed on to Molestown, a small cluster of hovels half buried in the earth, known for its tavern and the well-worn tunnel networks. The folk there were uneasy. One of the local elders confirmed that the 2 watchmen had passed by a day before, inquiring about rumors of wildling sightings. They never returned. The elder shook his head when asked if there had been sightings of the dead or anything unnatural. Yet his eyes flitted nervously. He confessed that he'd heard stories from travelers, that the wind carried strange howls at night, but no one could be sure. Ned's men exchanged grim glances. A hush seemed to settle on the settlement, thicker than the usual hush that came with the onset of night. Castle Black came into view a day later, standing at the base of the wall's immense, glimmering ice. Even from miles away, the wall dominated the horizon, a colossal barrier of pale blue-white that stretched impossibly high and vanished into the distance. Ned's party entered through the main gate, and they were greeted by black brothers in their dark cloaks, some gawking at the large northern host. Though small by any measure of a true army, the presence of so many armed men was an unusual sight for the Night's Watch. Jeor Mormont, the Lord Commander, met Ned in the courtyard. He looked older than the last time Ned had seen him, though still formidable with his broad shoulders and thick beard. A haggardness around his eyes hinted at sleepless nights. He greeted Ned with a grave nod. "Lord Stark, I had not expected you in such numbers. News of your coming reached us only recently. To what do we owe this surprise?" Ned dismounted, feeling the swirl of cold air bite into his skin. "I received word of unusual troubles, the sort that cannot be ignored. When I heard stories of a deserter speaking of White Walkers, and now finding 2 of your men dead, I couldn't remain idle. The North's safety is my responsibility." Mormont's eyes flickered with an emotion Ned couldn't quite place. Was it relief? Concern? The men we lost. That is not the only trouble, my lord. There have been sightings, rumors among the rangers. We've lost more men beyond the wall than we can account for. Some blame wildlings as always, but others, they whisper old stories. The ones we never thought would come to life. He sighed heavily. "It may be good that you've come." In the Lord Commander's solar, warmed by a single roaring fire, Ned and Mormont spoke at length. The men who had died in the clearing were among several rangers assigned to patrol closer to the Frostfangs. Most had vanished without a trace. Some believed a new wildling chieftain was gathering forces, which explained the disappearances. But a few survivors returned, speaking in frightened tones about the dead rising, about pale shadows that moved in the snow. Mormont himself looked unsettled. He was too pragmatic a leader to lend credence to hearsay without evidence. Yet he was no fool. Something was amiss. Ned told him of his dream and of the unease that plagued his nights. "I don't rely on visions, Lord Commander. But I cannot ignore the dread that's taken hold of me. And then there was that deserter. I should have tried him for desertion, but his terror, it gave me pause. Now I find your men dead in similar mystery, and the rumors that swirl match those of his story. If these White Walkers are truly stirring, Jeor Mormont's gaze held Ned's. The old bear clenched a fist. I'd always dismissed such talk as children's stories. But if that is changing, if something has awoken, we are not prepared. The watch has dwindled. Our numbers are too few to guard the hundreds of miles of the wall as we once did. Some nights, I swear the ice itself groans with more than just the shifting cold. They decided that Ned and some of his men, along with a contingent of the Night's Watch, would ride out beyond the wall to investigate the areas where the disappearances occurred. The journey promised danger, but they needed answers. Over supper in the common hall, men of the Night's Watch murmured among themselves at the sight of a Stark leading a force within their walls. Many were grateful, some were skeptical, but all recognized that the Northern Lord was not a man to chase gossip. If Ned Stark was here, truly believing in the threat, something dire must be happening. That night, Ned's rest was fitful again. He dreamt of the crypts beneath Winterfell, saw the statues of his forebears come to life in the flickering torchlight, each turning to him as if expecting him to speak or act. Then he found himself standing at the edge of a vast snowy expanse. The wind howled like a dirge. A figure drifted in the distance, tall and gaunt, skin as pale as fresh-fallen snow, eyes shimmering blue. Ned tried to call out, but his voice died in his throat. The figure raised a hand, and the wind seemed to intensify, biting through Ned's furs as though they weren't there. He woke, heart hammering, sweat running cold down his neck. Come morning, the men gathered in the courtyard, forming an expeditionary party. Mormont selected a dozen of his best remaining rangers, including Qhorin Halfhand, known for his cunning and skill beyond the wall. Ned assembled 24 Stark men, all seasoned in the North's harsh conditions. Each man bore layers of fur, boiled leather, mail, and gloves thick enough to stave off frostbite, at least for a while. Ned instructed the rest of his host to hold Castle Black as a fallback, lest trouble find them. Wordlessly, they moved toward the gate that opened into the tunnel through the wall. The immensity of the ice glistened overhead, like a pale blue vault. A hush fell over them as they passed, for this threshold represented a boundary between the relative safety of the Seven Kingdoms and the great unknown wilderness. On the other side, the sun was pale, its light weak. The land stretched out in a sweeping sea of white, dotted with dark pine forests and jagged foothills. The wind whipped across empty plains, carrying faint whispers of something intangible. Ned pressed on, flanked by Qhorin, Roderick, Jory, and the others. Their breath turned to clouds before them. The horses stepped cautiously, hooves crunching through crusty snow. It was strangely silent, aside from the susurration of the wind. They camped that night near a stand of ancient pines, building a ring of fires that crackled and spit sparks into the starless sky. Men ate in tense silence, occasionally breaking it with murmured jokes, but no one laughed for long. Ned sat on a log, staring into the flames, remembering how many nights he and Robert had sat around campfires during the rebellion, though then the air had been thick with the possibility of victory, not dread. He wondered if Robert could fathom the path Ned had chosen. Would he think him a fool? In the small hours, Ned rose to check on the sentries. He found them at the perimeter, their faces set in grim vigilance. One man, a brother named Devon, was trembling. He claimed he heard something rustling in the woods, something that made a soft, scraping sound in the snow. Ned patted his shoulder, urging him to keep his courage. But he, too, felt the prickle of unease on the back of his neck. For 3 days they rode deeper into the wilderness, following routes the rangers used to track wildling movements. They found little sign of anything living, no smoke from wildling fires, no footprints but those of small game. Qhorin Halfhand remained silent, watchful, scanning the horizon. Now and then, the party discovered scattered remnants of camps, but old, likely weeks or months old. Roderick Castle confided to Ned that it was eerily empty, that even the animals seemed to avoid them. On the fourth day, they came upon a carcass of a great elk, half buried in a snowdrift. Something had torn it apart, but there were no obvious tracks around it. The men dismounted, poking around uneasily. Corin pointed to deep gashes in the flesh that looked like they could have been made by swords or claws. Yet the surrounding snow lay undisturbed, aside from the few footprints made by Ned's party. It was as if the creature had been attacked in one place and dropped here, or had been devoured by a predator that left no trace. The silence pressed in on them more heavily. That night they set their camp in a small hollow sheltered from the worst of the wind by a rocky outcrop. Fires were lit, but they seemed to cast more shadows than comfort. Snow began drifting down, light at first, swirling around men's cloaks in delicate flurries. The watch rotation was doubled. No one wanted to be taken by surprise by some unknown horror. Sleep came fitfully for many, and Ned found himself dozing by the fire, only to wake every hour or two, heart pounding from half-remembered nightmares of flickering shadows in the trees. Near dawn, a rider came galloping back toward the camp from the perimeter, shouting for Lord Stark. Ned emerged from his tent, grabbing his sword and cloak. The rider was one of the black-cloaked rangers, a gaunt-faced man named Royce. He gasped out words of alarm. In a stand of woods not far from camp, he'd glimpsed movement in the darkness, shapes that seemed to glimmer in the faint moonlight, with eyes like icy fire. Before he could get closer, they vanished. But near where he'd seen them, he found footprints in the snow. Footprints that seemed to vanish as well. A cold wave washed over Ned. He ordered the camp roused. Within minutes, the entire party was awake. Men pulling on boots, strapping on swords, shivering in the gusts of biting wind. They set out in a wide formation, torches in hand, heading to the spot Royce had indicated. The sun was just cresting, a pale disk behind drifting clouds, as they entered the copse of evergreens. The snow underfoot was churned in places, as if something had slid across it, but no clear track remained. The air felt colder here, almost unnaturally so. More than one man muttered a prayer under his breath. Suddenly, one of the rangers let out a cry. He had found a patch of ice that seemed blue, unnaturally blue, shimmering even in the dim morning. It crackled underfoot differently than ordinary snow. Ned knelt to touch it. It felt dreadfully cold, as if it wanted to suck the warmth from his fingers. He looked up at Corin, who frowned deeply. They were all out of their depth here. As they stood, uncertain what to do, a branch snapped in the distance. Everyone whirled, swords half-drawn. Another snap, then silence. Ned's heart pounded. He advanced a few steps, torch in one hand, sword in the other. The swirl of snow thickened, making it difficult to see. A shape flickered at the edge of his vision. A tall figure, gaunt-limbed and pale. Ned's breath caught. He shouted for the men to close ranks. The shape vanished in the curtain of falling snow. Then a scream tore through the air from a man on their left flank. The entire group pivoted, saw a figure in black battered to the ground by something that glimmered pale as moonlight. Corin and two others rushed in, swords raised. Ned tried to follow, the snow dragging at his boots. Shadows flickered among the trees, shapes both graceful and terrifying. In a moment, Ned found himself face to face with a being like nothing he'd ever truly believed in. A white walker, tall and thin, skin like crystalline ice, eyes burning with a cold blue radiance that chilled the soul. It moved with inhuman speed, sidestepping Ned's sword blow as if it were a clumsy child's swing. The creature's weapon, a sword seemingly made of ice, flickered in the half-light. Time slowed. Ned felt his heart hammering so loudly it deafened him. The creature's face was a mask of alien beauty, as though sculpted from frost. Blue eyes bored into him, mocking in their silence. Ned wrenched his blade around for another strike. The White Walker parried with that impossibly thin sword. The clang was not like steel on steel, but more like a brittle, crystalline note that reverberated through Ned's bones. His arms trembled from the force of it. Corin lunged in from the side, calling out a war cry. The walker moved with fluidity, almost lazily turning aside Corin's strike. A swirl of snow enveloped them, and Ned lost sight of the half-hand. Another shape darted in, a second White Walker. The men were outmatched. They had the numbers, but not the advantage of knowledge or supernatural speed. Ned felt panic rising, fought it back, forced himself to focus. He was Eddard Stark of Winterfell, Warden of the North. He would not yield to fear. He glimpsed Roderick Castle engaging one of the creatures, sword smashing desperately at the icy blade. Sparks flew where Valyrian steel might have made a difference, but none among them carried such a weapon. Ned had left ice, the great sword, with Robb at Winterfell, and in any case he doubted even that massive blade would help now. The walker let out no cry, no hiss, no roar, just that eerie, silent determination. Another man yelled, a short, sharp cry that was abruptly cut off. A swirl of motion, and Ned was on the ground, the walker looming over him, sword raised. Ned scrambled, raising his own blade. The creature brought its sword down. Ned deflected, but his blade cracked near the tip. A chunk of steel fell into the snow, steaming. The walker's sword, despite striking steel, bore no mark. This is how I die, Ned thought with sudden calm. Then a roar split the air. Ghost. The direwolf? No, that was impossible. Ghost belonged to Jon Snow, who was at the wall. But it was a direwolf, indeed, huge and gray, barreling out of the trees. Where had it come from? It launched itself at the walker with savage ferocity. That moment's distraction was all Ned needed. He rolled, snatching up a burning torch from the ground and thrust it at the walker's face. The creature shrank back from the flames, giving Ned time to scramble to his feet. Fire, he recalled from old tales, might harm them. The walker hissed, a sound like wind across ice, and melted back into the swirl of white. Ned blinked through the snow, trying to see. The direwolf was gone again. Corran stumbled into view, blood on his cheek, eyes wild. "Fall back!" the ranger shouted. "We can't fight them here." The men retreated in a chaotic scramble, hauling the wounded, half carrying them through the deep snow. The White Walkers did not pursue beyond the copse of trees, or if they did, they were invisible, letting the swirling snow conceal them. At last, the expeditionary party regrouped in a wide clearing half a mile away. Some were missing. The men's faces were ashen. Ned counted quickly. At least 3 or 4 had fallen, possibly more. 2 horses were gone. Many of them bore cuts or bruises. A few stared in shock, uncomprehending that they still lived. Ned panted, sweat freezing on his brow. He turned to Corran. "We've seen them," he rasped, voice trembling with adrenaline. "By the gods, we've seen them. No one can doubt it now." The wind howled in reply, blowing flurries around them. They made for Castle Black at once, traveling with all haste. The wounded men moaned in the saddle. Ned's mind spun with horror. The stories were real. The White Walkers lived, and they were not content to stay hidden in the far corners of the world. If the realm remained ignorant, a catastrophe loomed. He wondered how many such forays the White Walkers had made. Had they tested the Watch's defenses, or was this just a scouting party? The questions pounded in his mind, but for now, survival was paramount. When they stumbled back through the gate in the wall, the watchman at Castle Black stared in alarm at the battered state of the returning party. Jeor Mormont rushed out to meet them, eyes darkening with anger and fear as Ned and Corran relayed what had happened. A hush fell over the courtyard as men overheard talk of White Walkers. Ned was sure the news would spread like wildfire through the Watch. The creatures out of legend were real. They had attacked. Some men had died. In the Lord Commander's solar that evening, Ned and Mormont faced each other across a wooden table. Between them lay a ragged scrap of cloth torn from a black cloak. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones, the candlelight throwing flickering shadows on the walls. Mormont swallowed. "We have to send word to the other castles along the wall. We have to warn them." Ned nodded. "That won't be enough. This threat, it's beyond the Watch alone. We must warn the rest of the realm. Robert must be told." Mormont's brows knit. "You refused his summons, but now I fear he will interpret this as some ploy. Or worse, he may not believe you. The realm has not seen White Walkers in thousands of years." "I know," Ned said quietly. "But he will believe me or not. Either way, I have a duty to warn him. I will send ravens not just to King's Landing, but to every great lord. They must know the truth." They talked late into the night. The watch's resources were stretched thin, but Mormont proposed to send as many rangers as he could spare to watch for any sign of further movements. They would shore up supplies, attempt to recruit more men. Ned knew it was a desperate plan. The entire realm had for generations neglected the watch, letting it dwindle. Now the threat was real and they were woefully unprepared. When Ned finally stumbled to bed, his mind was ablaze with questions and dread. The haunting eyes of the White Walker kept returning to him, burning cold as the spaces between the stars. Sleep offered him no peace, only fleeting glimpses of pale forms in the swirling snow. He awoke before dawn, swallowed a meager meal, and went to speak with his men. Many were shaken, but all had renewed loyalty. They had glimpsed the truth. Ned thanked them for their bravery, reminding them that the safety of the North and the realm might depend on their courage. 2 days later, ravens flew from Castle Black, black silhouettes against a steel-gray sky, each bearing Ned's urgent warning. He chose his words carefully, explaining that he had personally encountered a threat beyond the wall that matched the old legends of the others. He called upon the great houses to prepare for a new war, one like none they had ever fought. He knew well how men might scoff, but perhaps, if the warnings reached them all at once, the realm might be stirred to readiness. If Robert refused to heed him, perhaps the other lords would at least pay attention. Yet Ned knew ravens could be ignored, or delayed, or even lost. He resolved to bring further proof. They had the bodies of 2 dead rangers at Castle Black, but they had not risen as whites, at least not yet. If only he could capture or slay a walker or find some undeniable evidence. But that notion was akin to madness. He had no illusions that a second confrontation might leave him or his men alive. In the days that followed, Ned busied himself with the watch's preparations. He aided Mormont in rallying the brothers, speaking frankly of what he had seen, urging them to cling to discipline and vigilance. He helped inspect defenses, though he knew little could be done to significantly improve the massive stretch of the wall in so short a time. The men admired him for staying, for risking his life among them. He was no soft southern lord, they said. He was Stark, and that name still meant something in the north. But with each passing day, Ned's concern for Winterfell grew. If the threat advanced south, would Robb be prepared to defend the castle? And what of his wife, his children? He felt torn, wanting to ride home to personally ensure their safety, but also needing to remain at the wall to rally what forces he could. Winterfell was not so far from the wall in comparison to King's Landing or Highgarden. If the walkers broke through, the seat of House Stark could be the first great castle to stand against them. The thought chilled him more than the northern winds ever could. The watchers on the wall reported nothing new except scattered sightings of wildlings fleeing south. Some groups approached the gates, begging for shelter, raving about white shadows, slaughtering their villages. Mormont allowed some inside, questioning them for details. The wildling stories were harrowing, filled with half-coherent accounts of entire camps butchered in the night. Some told of the dead walking, glowing-eyed monsters that turned the snow red with blood. Others told more outlandish tales of ice spiders, tall as hounds, creeping in the darkness. Men shuddered to hear them. Ned began to realize this was no mere fluke. There was a genuine campaign of terror happening beyond the wall. The White Walkers were advancing, systematically annihilating or driving out the wildling population. Fear rippled through Castle Black. Mormont urged caution. The Watch could not ride out in force, for they were too few, and the foe was unknown and terrifying. They needed reinforcements from the south. They needed the realm to stand behind them. One cold morning, a half-frozen wildling woman arrived at the gates, clutching a starved infant. She was taken to the common hall, given broth and blankets. Ned spoke with her, though her accent was thick and her words often jumbled by exhaustion and trauma. She told of a great host of undead men marching under the silent direction of pale-skinned demons, with eyes as blue as sapphires. "We run, we hide," she whispered. "They find us in the night. My man was taken." She broke down, sobbing, the baby wailing weakly in her arms. This testimony only confirmed Ned's worst fears. The White Walkers were raising whites to bolster their numbers, adding every fallen foe to their ranks. The logic of it was terrifyingly efficient. If the realm did not unify against this threat, it could be overrun in a tide of cold death. And still, he thought grimly, men in their comfortable southern holds might scoff at the idea. By the time they believed it, it could be far too late. A week passed with no word from any southern ravens. Tension mounted. Then, on a dark evening, as sleet rattled against the windows, a single raven arrived from Winterfell. Ned tore open the letter, heart pounding. It was from Robb. The message was hurried, the script unsteady, telling Ned that a raven had come from King's Landing. Robert was furious at Ned's refusal to travel south, believing he had spurned the crown's authority. Worse, there were rumors that Queen Cersei Lannister thought Ned was plotting something in the north, some rebellion or scheme. The letter ended with Robb's anxious words. "Mother says we stand by you, come what may. We are fortifying Winterfell as best we can. But we need you, father. The realm is turning suspicious, and I fear war could come from the south if the king or his Lannisters see us as traitors." Ned set the parchment down, hands trembling with rage and fear. Instead of uniting, the realm threatened to tear itself apart in suspicion and arrogance. He felt the weight of duty pressing on him like an anvil. Now, not only did he have to contend with the threat beyond the wall, but also the possibility that the crown might move against House Stark. He could almost hear Robert's angry voice, cursing him for ignoring the summons. What would Robert do? March north with an army, just to force Ned south? The absurdity was overshadowed only by the mortal danger at hand. He conferred with Mormont. This could be a disaster. If the realm's armies are turned against each other, the wall will stand alone. The White Walkers might march upon us unopposed. Mormont nodded gravely. "I fear you are right. The men in King's Landing have never truly understood the threat. Even in the best of times, they give the watch no heed." Ned paced. He wrestled with the question of what to do next. Returning to Winterfell felt necessary. If his family was threatened by southern politics, how could he abandon them? But leaving the wall felt like a betrayal of his duty as well. In the end, the choice was forced upon him. If Robert truly believed Ned was plotting rebellion, the entire north could be at risk of invasion. That would fracture the kingdom at the worst possible time. The White Walkers would only profit from such chaos. The next morning, Ned stood atop the wall, looking out over the vast white wilderness. He felt the cold wind on his face, stinging his eyes. He remembered his dream of a silent horde advancing. With iron in his voice, he made a decision. He would ride back to Winterfell with a portion of his men to secure the north against any threat from the south. At the same time, he would do everything in his power to bolster the watch. He would leave behind another contingent of Stark soldiers to reinforce Castle Black, along with essential supplies. Those men would be placed under the command of a loyal bannerman well-versed in winter warfare. Meanwhile, Ned would try one last time to reason with Robert. If they could not unify the realm peacefully, it would be the ruin of them all. When he announced this plan to his men, there were mixed feelings. Some were relieved to be heading home, others worried about dividing their strength. Mormont, for his part, was stoic. "Do what you must, my lord," he said. "We will hold the wall as we always have. Pray the gods give us strength." They clasped forearms in farewell. Ned felt a pang of guilt, but also knew he could not stay. Not when his own seat, his own children, might be threatened by misunderstanding or malicious rumor. They rode out of Castle Black before dawn, the winds howling around them. The path south was marginally easier than the trek beyond the wall, but Ned's mind was in turmoil. He kept remembering the terror on that day in the snowy woods, the lightning-fast slash of an ice blade. He pictured the quiet, methodical intelligence in that pale face. The White Walkers might be an ancient evil, but they were no mindless beasts. They had strategy, cunning, Each day the realm delayed uniting against them was another day they could grow stronger. He tried to console himself with the knowledge that he was leaving men behind to aid the watch. But in truth, he knew it might not be nearly enough. The north was large, and winter was coming. Could they muster an army in time? Even if they did, how would they fight such foes? Fire seemed the only weapon. Did they need dragonglass, as the old tales suggested? Valyrian steel? The questions plagued him. As the days passed, Ned and his party traveled swiftly south, meeting little resistance on the King's Road. Some villages they passed were abandoned, possibly from fear of bandits or the rumored strife brewing in the realm. A sense of looming crisis hung in the air. Men whispered of tensions at King's Landing, of the Lannisters stirring trouble. Others spoke of the possibility that the Targaryen girl across the narrow sea might be planning an invasion. Ned could scarcely keep track of the swirling rumors. Yet overshadowing it all was the knowledge that, in the far north, an older terror was awakening. Finally, they approached Winterfell. The sight of the gray walls brought a rush of relief and apprehension. The gates opened for Ned Stark, and a horn sounded to announce his return. He was greeted in the courtyard by Robb, Catelyn, and the rest of his children save Rickon, who was likely asleep in the hour before dawn. Catelyn embraced him, warmth and worry radiating from her. Robb, looking older than his years, stoically gave his father a respectful bow before hugging him tightly. Arya bounded forward, eyes bright, an unspoken question on her lips. Had he truly fought the monsters in the snow? Sansa stood by, looking wary but relieved, as if the weight of rumors from King's Landing had worn her down. Bran, perched on a small wooden seat with wheels, gazed up at Ned with a mixture of wonder and fear, perhaps recalling old Nan's stories of the long night. Ned led them inside, to the warmth of the great hall, where a fire roared and servants bustled. He recounted all that had happened. The journey beyond the wall, the battle with the White Walkers, the decisions made with Mormont, the ravens sent south. As he spoke, the watchers in the hall grew pale. Robb's mouth tightened. "Then it's true," he said quietly. "We're truly at war with them." The men in earshot crossed themselves, or muttered prayers to the old gods and the new. Catelyn's face was grave as she laid a hand on Ned's arm. "We must make the other lords understand. If Robert won't listen, then we need allies who will." Ned nodded. "I'll send further ravens from Winterfell, urging them to heed the warning. We'll gather what strength we can. I only pray Robert sees sense before it's too late." In the days that followed, Ned held council with the northern lords who could arrive quickly: Galbart Glover, Meege Mormont, Wyman Manderly's representative, and others. He described the White Walkers in detail, the urgent need to prepare. Though shocked, most pledged to follow the Stark banner if it came to war. By the fireside, they spoke of forging dragonglass weapons, of searching the libraries at Winterfell for any old tomes on how to fight the others. They set watchers along the northern roads to sound the alarm if the walkers ventured further south. News trickled in from the south as well, mostly dire. King Robert had indeed taken offense at Ned's refusal. The Lannisters whispered that House Stark was positioning itself for rebellion. Some rumored that the king might march north to bring Ned Stark to heel. Ned read these letters with a heavy heart. It seemed that, in the face of the greatest threat in millennia, the realm might be undone by petty politics. But Ned clung to hope that Robert's old friendship with him would prevail. He prepared a letter, bearing the direwolf seal, once more explaining the threat and beseeching the king to set aside suspicions. House Stark had no interest in rebellion. The enemy lay in the north, not the south. As the first snows began to swirl more thickly around Winterfell, Ned stood upon the ramparts. The men and women of the castle bustled below, securing stores of grain, reinforcing walls, ensuring the livestock were sheltered. A hush fell over the courtyard as darkness settled. Torches danced in sconces along the walls. Arya was practicing her footwork with wooden sword in the training yard, ignoring the cold, determined to grow stronger. Sansa watched from a window, lost in her own thoughts of knights and heroes. Bran read ancient histories, seeking mention of the others and ways they'd been defeated in the past. Over the next weeks, more ravens arrived. A few from smaller houses promising men. Some from Mormont at the Wall, describing further sightings. But none from King Robert. A chilling silence from King's Landing. Ned feared that either his letters were intercepted, or Robert's anger was too great for him to respond. Meanwhile, rumors swirled that Tywin Lannister was gathering his forces at Casterly Rock. Tension between the North and the Crown threatened to boil over. One evening, a small party arrived at Winterfell, men in the royal livery. Leading them was a messenger bearing a sealed scroll. Ned received him in the Great Hall. The man handed over the missive without ceremony, bowed, and claimed he would await Lord Stark's response. Ned broke the seal, scanning the words. They were from Robert. The letter was brief and laced with anger, demanding Ned come south immediately to clarify his wild claims, and threatening that if Ned refused, the Crown might view it as insubordination. There was no mention of White Walkers, no indication Robert believed any part of the threat. Ned's hand shook. The foolish, dear friend he once called his brother was letting court intrigue blind him to an existential danger. Catelyn, seeing his expression, placed a steadying hand on his arm. Robb stood behind them, bristling at the perceived insult. Ned closed his eyes, recalling the monstrous face of the Walker. How could Robert dismiss it so lightly? But refusing again risked civil war, which would be an even greater gift to the White Walkers, who would find the realm divided and unprepared. Ned understood, with chilling clarity, that if the king marched north, the realm would be too busy fighting among themselves to notice the horde of the dead creeping ever closer. The only choice was to parley, to go to Robert and try one last time to open his eyes. Yet how could he leave the north vulnerable? Could he travel alone? That would be too dangerous, and the Lannisters might seize him as a hostage. He'd need guards, but not so many as to cause alarm. A delicate balance. That night, Ned again roamed the Godswood for answers. The face of the ancient weirwood was blank and unreadable, its red leaves stirring faintly in the breeze. He bowed his head, murmuring half-formed prayers. In the stillness, he almost imagined he heard a whisper. "Do not leave us undefended." He wasn't sure if it was just the wind in the leaves or the old god speaking. Either way, he took it to heart. If he rode south, he must be sure Winterfell was guarded. He would leave Robb behind again, this time with even clearer instructions. The boy had grown in his father's absence, learning to command men. Perhaps the old gods had prepared him for this. 2 days later, Ned made his decision. He would ride to King's Landing with a modest escort, perhaps 20 loyal men, to face Robert and the Lannisters. He would speak the truth plainly, hoping to break through the court's web of intrigue. He penned a final letter to Mormont, telling him of his plan to go south and plead the Watch's cause. He urged the Lord Commander to remain vigilant, to keep sending ravens if the threat escalated. In the courtyard, Ned embraced Catelyn. They shared a brief kiss, a moment of warmth amid the gloom. She whispered, "Come back to us, and bring the king's help if you can." He nodded, though his heart felt heavy. He clasped Robb's shoulder firmly, reminded him to keep the north prepared. If the White Walkers press south, you must close the gates, store your supplies. Send out riders to gather the bannermen. Have them stand ready. This is no ordinary foe, my son. Robb set his jaw, determination shining in his eyes. Arya stood by, biting her lip. Ned bent down, ruffling her hair, telling her to keep practicing. She gave him that fierce, stubborn look he knew so well. Sansa was more subdued, curtsying with perfect poise, though tears glimmered in her eyes. "Be safe, father," she whispered. Bran watched from his chair, eyes full of longing for the day he might ride with his father. Rickon clung to Catelyn's skirts, not fully understanding but sensing the tension. Theon hovered nearby, uncertain of his role in this changing world. With a final glance at them all, Ned swung into the saddle of his gray stallion. Roderick Castle and a handful of Stark guards lined up behind him, their breaths steaming in the chill air. The gates opened. Overhead, the sky brooded with thick clouds, as though eager to unleash another storm. Ned turned his horse south, resolved to face the king, to face the realm, to do what was necessary for the living. As they rode out, Winterfell's walls faded behind them like a memory slipping into the past. Though Ned knew he was traveling away from the heart of the menace, away from the White Walkers who crept ever closer, he also understood that only unity could save Westeros. To achieve that unity, he had to confront the mortal follies of men as surely as he'd confronted the immortal horror in the north. His duty called him onward, into the lion's den of King's Landing. Winterfell stood behind him, strong and vigilant, preparing for the storm of ice and death that waited beyond the wall. And Ned Stark, haunted by visions and armed with the truth, marched south into the swirling machinations of a court that might well doom them all if it refused to listen. In the weeks to come, the outcome of his fateful choice would be tested. Old loyalties would be strained, old friendships questioned, and new threats would arise in the shadows. Yet there was no turning back. If winter was coming, then Eddard Stark would do everything in his power to ensure that the living did not face it divided and blind. And somewhere far to the north, amid howling winds and endless snow, the White Walkers waited with silent, patient intent, their blue eyes shining like distant stars, harbingers of a night that would swallow empires if left unchecked. Ned Stark departed Winterfell at first light, accompanied by 20 loyal men. The morning was cold enough to frost the whiskers on every bearded face among them, and even the horse's breath rose in clouds of white. They trotted beneath the raised portcullis without a fanfare, only the long, low moan of the wind and the dull thump of hooves on hard-packed snow. Robb Stark, now left behind in Winterfell, stood watching from the battlements, his cloak lifted in the chill breeze, jaw set with the weight of duties he had not expected so soon. Catelyn stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder and the other clutched tight around the folds of her cloak, her face stiff with emotion as Ned and his guard vanished down the King's Road. Once, in younger days, Ned would have felt a pang of relief at leaving behind the heavy responsibilities that brooded in Winterfell. The North was never easy to rule, and the burden often felt like an iron weight upon his shoulders. But now, as he guided his horse onto the familiar track south, that old sense of reluctant freedom did not come. He felt only dread. He was riding away from a threat that he himself had witnessed, a terror like nothing he had ever believed possible until it flashed before his own eyes. White Walkers, the others from the stories. They were real and they were stirring. They were not content to slumber in distant myths anymore. But duty demanded he try to unite the realm. The unity of men was their only hope, if King Robert and the lords of the Seven Kingdoms would only listen. He thought often of that fateful skirmish beyond the wall, when pale figures with blazing blue eyes had cut down his men as easily as an expert huntsman felling stags. A dire wolf, he still could not fathom from whence it came, had given him enough time to survive. He remembered the Walkers' swords of ice, how they clashed against steel with a chilling ring that set his teeth on edge. He remembered how the cold emanating from them seemed to sap his strength and stiffen his limbs. He remembered the hush afterward, and how he had thought, "Is this what the end of the world feels like?" Since that day, his fear was tempered by resolve. If the realm did not prepare, that hush would fall over them all. They rode hard for the first few days, determined to reach Moat Cailin before any early storms made the path impassable. The King's Road was still in fair condition this far south, though snow sometimes drifted across it in tall banks. Ned's escort was a mix of Stark guardsmen, some sworn swords from old, loyal families, others younger men eager to prove their worth. Ser Roderick Castle rode at his right hand, face grim beneath white-whiskered cheeks. Jory Castle, similarly solemn, rode near the front. Both men had glimpsed enough of what lay beyond the wall to take this mission as seriously as their lord. Their nights were spent in meager camps. Sometimes they took shelter in small holdfasts, where the folk were astonished to find Lord Stark himself knocking at their gates. Word had begun to spread that Ned Stark was riding south at last. The men and women they encountered whispered of troubles. Rumors of an angry king, rumors that House Lannister was preparing for war, rumors of wildlings crossing the neck. But few whispered of White Walkers, for that threat seemed too large, too impossible for them to grasp. Men might talk of whites as a cautionary story, but they did not truly believe they would meet such horrors in their own lifetimes. When the company neared Moat Cailin, they beheld the ancient towers rising crooked from the swamps like broken fangs. The fortress was all but abandoned now, manned by a token garrison who maintained watch over the neck. Ned and his men forded muddy water where the road sank into damp marsh. Frogs croaked in the reeds. It was the North's southern sentinel, built to repel invaders from the south, once a mighty stronghold, now crumbling. Ned wondered if this ancient ruin might soon see new purpose. If Robert or Tywin Lannister brought an army north, Moat Cailin could slow them. But it was no longer the unbreachable fortress of old. They passed a night within the sagging walls, greeted by the garrison's captain, a gruff man with watery eyes. He offered them bowls of onion soup and stale bread. Ned politely accepted, though hunger made any meal welcome. Over the low glow of a peat fire, the captain expressed confusion over the letters and ravens that had been flying here and there across the north. He'd heard talk of monstrous beasts in the far north, but he dismissed it as something for the watch to worry about, not for them. Ned gave him no argument. Better not to waste breath on a man who had no power to aid him. In time, the truth would become apparent to all if the realm survived that long. At dawn, they pressed on, winding through the neck with its salt marshes and pale green vistas. Near the southern edges, the terrain slowly rose again. The wind carried a hint of warmth, or at least less chill than the air near Winterfell. They began to pass the occasional merchant caravan heading north, all of whom gave Ned's men a wide berth. Several caravans had hired swords, suspicious eyes watching from under wide-brimmed hats. The word was out that House Stark and the crown might be at odds. Few dared linger to ask questions, and Ned's men had no desire to share details with strangers. Only once did they stop to ask a pair of merchants if they had any letters or news from King's Landing. The merchants knew little of substance, only that the city buzzed with rumor, that the king was in a great rage, and that the queen's family was restless. Beyond the neck, the land spread into rolling plains. Here, Ned could see the first signs of farmland not yet buried by snow. Farmsteads dotted the horizon, with curling wisps of smoke rising from stone chimneys. Sturdy fences enclosed winter crops. Some flocks of sheep still grazed in lowland fields, guarded by wary shepherds who looked up as the column of Stark men trotted by. Here and there, curious children waved from a distance, only to be hurried along by anxious mothers. The North's presence in these southern lands was not common, and many had never seen so many northern soldiers together, not since Robert's rebellion. Each night, Ned found his thoughts drifting to Winterfell. He pictured Robb guiding the fortress's daily routine, dealing with visiting lords, and reading new letters from the wall. He thought of Arya, practicing her water dance footwork in the courtyard, or Sansa, writing new songs in her chamber. It all felt impossibly distant. The memory of that silent, frigid clearing beyond the wall haunted him. He tried to imagine how Robert would react when he arrived in King's Landing. Would the king let him speak? Or would old grievances and new suspicions smother any hope of unity? Around midday on their 12th day from Winterfell, they came upon a grim sight, a small camp in disarray at the side of the road. Tents had been slashed, wagons overturned, and the bodies of 2 men lay among the wreckage. Ravens circled overhead, cawing. Ned halted his men, and they proceeded with caution, swords half drawn. A survivor stumbled out from behind an upended cart, a gaunt fellow with wild eyes and dried blood crusted in his hair. He gaped at them, then nearly collapsed. Ned dismounted and hurried to kneel beside him. "Robbers?" Ned asked, though it looked more like a massacre than a simple robbery. The man's voice was hoarse. "Bandits or sellswords. They came for our coin, our cargo, killed everyone who resisted. I hid gods. I'm the only one left." Ned and his men checked the area. Whatever the attackers had wanted, they had taken it, though from the scattered crates it appeared to be mostly goods for trade. Dried fish, salted meats, some furs. A few silver coins lay in the mud, overlooked. Robbers often left none behind, so perhaps it had been a rushed raid. Roderick Castle found footprints leading back toward a set of low hills. Ned sighed, feeling tension coil inside him. The realm was unraveling, if outlaws were brazenly attacking travelers on the King's Road itself. War had a way of birthing lawlessness long before armies clashed. He gave the lone survivor what little they could spare: a blanket, some bread, a pouch of copper coins. "There's a holdfast 2 leagues south," Ned told him. "Seek shelter there. Tell them Lord Stark sent you." The man nodded, dazed but grateful, and staggered down the road. Ned suspected he might die in a ditch if he didn't find help quickly. It was a harsh world, and getting harsher. As Ned remounted, Jory Castle rode up beside him. "My lord, we could track them. They can't be too far ahead." Ned shook his head. "We don't have time. We must reach King's Landing soon, or events will outrun us." He spared a glance at the bodies. A sense of guilt pricked at him. Once, he might have delayed to hunt down those outlaws. That was the man he was, or tried to be. But the threat from the north, the precarious state of the realm, he had to focus on the greater danger. "Let us press on," he said quietly. They rode until dusk stretched long shadows across the plains. One of Ned's men scouted ahead and found an inn along the road, a modest structure with a stable and a tall wooden fence. It was run by a gruff woman with a limp who called herself Mudge. She recognized the Stark sigil at once and bustled to prepare rooms and hot stew. Though the inn was hardly luxurious, it was a welcome change from the open road. Ned's men arranged themselves in 2 cramped loft chambers, bedrolls laid side by side. Ned himself took a small private room behind the hearth. Even that was little more than a straw mattress and a narrow window. As they settled in, Mudge's daughters served steaming bowls of barley stew with bits of goat. The men ate hungrily, warming themselves from the inside. Ned, too, was grateful for the hot meal, though his appetite waned as he overheard the conversation around him. A few other travelers shared the common room: 2 hedge knights, who huddled at a corner table, and a merchant from Maidenpool with a well-trimmed mustache. The merchant spoke in urgent tones about the growing tension in King's Landing, how the king was rumored to be mustering men. The hedge knights expressed interest. Conflict meant coin for swords for hire. Ned stared into his stew, swirling the spoon idly. Robert, mustering men. For what purpose? To march north and force House Stark to heel if Ned refused to answer his summons? That would be the height of madness, but no more mad than anything else that had befallen Westeros lately. If the realm turned on itself, the others would face a divided kingdom. It felt like a nightmare in which Ned was running through thick snow, calling out warnings that no one could hear. He finished his stew, then excused himself to his room. Sleep came in fitful spurts, broken by images of swirling snow and glowing blue eyes. In the darkest hour, he woke with a jolt, the sound of a faint howl echoing in his dream. He lay there in the straw bed, heart thundering, until the first pale light of dawn crept under the door. Duty, he reminded himself. That is all that is left. They rode out again, the chill wind scouring their faces. The land sloped gradually downward, passing from the north's domain toward the riverlands. The wide, winding waters of the Salt Spear lay to their east, hidden behind low hills. Leafless trees lined the road in sparse clumps. As they entered the riverlands proper, they began to see more villages. Some small, thriving communities, others half abandoned. The talk in these hamlets was of recent bandit attacks, taxes demanded by passing lords, and the uncertain posture of House Tully at Riverrun. "Lord Hoster is ill," one old man at a roadside inn confided. "They say he barely rises from bed, so the kingdom's troubles might pass him by, or might devour us if war breaks out." Ned took little solace in the rumor. Catelyn's father had been a strong man once, but age and illness came for all. If he were truly too frail to lead, then the Riverlands lacked a formidable voice at the King's Court, another blow to the hope of forging an alliance against the threat from the north. They followed the King's Road's curve, crossing a wide bridge over a surging river. It was the Red Fork, cold and swollen with winter runoff. Beyond it lay a country of gentle hills and wooded groves. The men tried to make good time, riding from dawn to dusk each day, but the weather turned sour, gray clouds overhead, occasional blasts of frigid rain. After nearly a fortnight on the road, the lights of an unfamiliar town glimmered ahead one evening. Jory rode up to Ned. "We're nearing the crossroads, my lord." Ned nodded. The Crossroads Inn was a well-known place, a key junction where the road to the Vale branched off. It was said travelers from every corner of the realm might meet there. If there was any place to gather intelligence on the state of King's Landing, this would be it. And if Robert had truly mustered men, the rumor would run thick. As they approached, they saw that the inn's courtyard bustled with activity. Several wagons were parked outside, men darting back and forth carrying barrels and crates. Torchlight illuminated the wooden sign, depicting a crossroad. The inn itself was large, 2 stories, with an attached stable that already looked crowded. Ned dismounted, instructing Jory to see to the horses. The chill rain was dripping from the eaves, and the courtyard smelled of wet hay and manure. Over the patter, Ned heard raised voices from within the common room. When he ducked under the inn's low lintel, he was greeted by a blast of heat, smoke, and noise. Torch brackets lined the walls, and a roaring hearth blazed at the far end. Dozens of travelers filled the benches and tables, eating, drinking, or arguing. A plump innkeeper hustled between them, doling out flagons of ale, while a pair of servers tried to keep pace. Ned stepped forward, pushing back his hood. The innkeeper started to greet him with a practiced smile. Then her eyes went wide as she recognized the Stark features and cloak. "Lord Stark," she said, lowering her voice, "we heard you might be traveling south. My inn is yours if you'd have it." She glanced about nervously, as if worried any sign of partiality might cause trouble in these uncertain times. Ned assured her they'd pay like any other travelers. Then he indicated that he had about 20 men with him who needed lodging, or at least floor space and meals. The woman swallowed, rubbed her palms on her apron, and nodded. "We'll find room somehow." Ned asked for a private table if possible. The innkeeper led him to an alcove near the hearth, separated by a half-wall that afforded some measure of quiet. Jory and a few of the other guard captains joined him there. The others spread out to find seats where they could, stacking their wet cloaks beside them, grateful for the warmth of a fire. A sour-faced serving woman eventually brought them trenchers of brown bread and bowls of venison stew, along with watered-down ale. The smell alone made Ned realize how hungry he was. As he ate, he scanned the crowded room. Merchants, sellswords, a few hedge knights, and a motley assortment of travelers from across the realm. Some wore threadbare cloaks that marked them as small folk. Others sported the bright colors of lesser lordly houses, though Ned couldn't immediately identify them in the flickering torchlight. At one table, he glimpsed a boy in the black cloak of the Night's Watch, an odd sight so far south. The boy looked no older than 16, nervous and out of place. A rising voice drew Ned's gaze. 2 men in patchwork leathers were arguing with a merchant in a green coat. The words taxes and roads carried above the din tensions in the realm had trickled down to every crossroad. The arguments felt like the prelude to a thunderstorm. Ned saw the innkeeper hovering, ready to intervene if the dispute turned violent. By the time Ned finished his stew, his limbs felt stiff with road weariness. He asked the innkeeper to arrange a meeting with any travelers who had come recently from King's Landing. She promised to send any such persons to him, if they were willing. The Stormlands, the Vale, and the Crownlands all fed into this inn, so rumors flowed freely. Ned hoped for more than rumor. He needed truth of Robert's mood, of the Lannisters' intentions, of any sign that the realm might heed his warnings. At length, an older man in a threadbare cloak approached, battered hat in hand. He bowed stiffly. "Beg your pardon, my lord," he said. "I'm Garland, a trader from Crackclaw Point. I've been to King's Landing just 2 weeks past. The innkeeper said you wanted news?" Ned gestured for him to sit. I do. What can you tell me of the king?" Garland settled himself, looking grateful for the seat. "King Robert's been restless, my lord. The talk in the city is that he's near to sending riders to all corners of the realm, calling banners to gather at the capital. Some say he means to march on the north. He glanced at Ned's face and hurried on. I know naught of the truth. I only know what men mutter in wine sinks and around cookfires. Ned's jaw tightened. Has Robert given any official word why he'd march? The man hesitated. Some say he's angered that you've refused his summons. Others say the Queen's father, Lord Tywin, is pressing for an armed response to your rebellion. He winced, as though expecting Ned to strike him. I don't believe it, my lord, but men in King's Landing say Lord Stark defies the king's will. That's the rumor. Ned exhaled slowly. And who spreads such rumors? The Queen's men. Garland admitted. Them and others who attach themselves to the Lannisters. The city's ripe with tension. Goldcloaks patrol in double numbers. They say the king feasts often, but he's not smiling behind his cups. He seems troubled, short-tempered. The hand seat is empty. Jon Arryn's replacement has yet to be named. If the king does plan to name you, he's kept it secret. Still, many speak of you as the hand that will not come. A bitter taste gathered in Ned's mouth. He thanked Garland for his candor and gave him a few copper stars. The man bowed and withdrew. So it was as he feared. Robert's wrath was stoked by the Lannisters and by the swirl of rumors. Ned's attempt to warn the realm of the White Walkers was being twisted into talk of rebellion. If a single Lannister blade was raised, if a single drop of blood was spilled, it might unleash a conflagration. And who would stand against the others then? Before he could dwell on the worst possibilities, the innkeeper approached again, this time with the boy Ned had noticed in the black cloak of the Night's Watch. The lad looked anxious, hands bunched at his sides. This is Will, the innkeeper said. He claims he's a messenger, or was, for the Lord Commander. He heard you were inquiring about news from the north, too. Ned's brow rose in surprise. A brother of the Watch so far south? He asked gently. You're far from Castle Black, lad. Will nodded, swallowing hard. My lord, the Lord Commander Jeor Mormont, sent me with letters for certain lords in the Vale to plead for more men and supplies. Our numbers are too thin, my lord. He hesitated, glancing around as though someone might overhear. But the lords in the Vale paid me no mind. They said the Watch can fend for itself. Some told me to run along. I still have letters for King's Landing. The Lord Commander hopes the king might send help. Ned studied the boy's face. He looked near exhaustion, with hollow cheeks and red-rimmed eyes. Sit, lad, Ned said, gesturing to the bench. You're headed to King's Landing alone? Will said, lowering himself. No one else volunteered for the trip, my lord. I can't return to Castle Black until I've delivered every letter. It's my duty. Ned nodded, admiring the boy's sense of obligation. He'd once told a deserter from the Watch that a man's duty was the sum of his honor. Now, seeing a young brother carrying out a difficult mission, Ned felt anew how vital that duty was. The roads are dangerous, he warned. You'd be wise to travel with a larger party. Ride with me to King's Landing, if you like. I'd welcome your company. Surprise flickered across Will's features, followed by relief. Yes, my lord, I would be in your debt. Then it's settled, Ned said. Your letters must reach the king's hand. Or, if the king won't read them, then we'll ensure someone in authority does. Will nodded. Thank you, my lord, he said softly. Then he seemed to recall something. Did you see anything when you were at Castle Black, my lord? The men talk of strange sightings. Some say you went beyond the wall yourself. Ned suppressed a shiver at the memory. We did. And we found what we found. I suggest you keep your focus on your letters, lad. There are dangers in the north. Far worse than bandits. Will blinked, pale as milk, then nodded. He had doubtless heard the stories from the other brothers. Perhaps it was a relief to him that a High Lord believed them. Or perhaps it frightened him more. When the boy left, Ned spoke quietly with Roderick, Jory, and the others. We may expect no easy welcome in King's Landing. The Lannisters likely suspect us of ill intent. Robert's temper grows shorter by the day, if what we hear is true. We must tread carefully. He paused, lowering his voice further. But we cannot yield on the matter of the White Walkers. The realm must be warned. A hush settled over them. They remembered the day in the haunted forest, how men had fallen. They remembered the unnatural chill, the eerie silence of those pale figures. No matter the threat in the south, they could not forget what truly mattered. They spent the night at the Crossroads Inn, each man grateful for a roof and a bed, however lumpy. In the small hours of morning, Ned startled awake from a dream. He was once again beyond the wall, face to face with a White Walker. In the dream, the Walker's sword of ice glimmered like moonlit glass, and when it struck Ned's own blade, the steel shattered into shards that flew like glass needles. Then the ground opened beneath Ned's feet, swallowing him into darkness. He woke drenched in sweat, the night air in the room cold on his skin. For a long while, he lay staring at the ceiling, his heart thundering. By the time they left the inn, the day had dawned gray and spitting rain. The roads were thick with mud and puddles, slowing their pace. The gloom felt like an ill omen, but Ned forced himself onward. They had to reach King's Landing. Perhaps if he could stand before Robert, face to face as old friends once more, he could make the king see sense. Yet an unspoken fear gnawed at him. What if Robert, in his rage and the queen's manipulations, simply refused to listen? What if the realm had grown too deaf to heed any warning? South of the Crossroads Inn, the terrain shifted again. Low, rolling hills gave way to flatter stretches dotted with farmland. The further they traveled, the denser the traffic on the road. They began encountering parties of soldiers wearing various sigils. Boars, sons, sigils of lesser crownlands' houses. Some recognized the direwolf banner and cast suspicious glances. Others paid them no mind. Ned kept his men close, not wishing any confrontation. One day they passed a large column of men-at-arms wearing House Rosby's device. The group paused a moment, exchanging tense nods. No words were spoken, but Ned sensed the simmering tension. War had not yet broken out, but the roads were patrolled now with an energy that hinted at readiness. Along the way, Will the Night's Watch messenger proved a quiet, earnest companion. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, but Ned could see the boy's eyes taking in everything. Now and then, he asked about the king's court or about the turmoil in the realm, and Ned answered honestly as best he could. The boy seemed both eager and afraid to see the capital. "I've never been outside the north, my lord," he confessed once as they rode side by side. Castle Black was the first stone fortress I'd seen. They say King's Landing is full of wonders. Ned grimaced faintly, remembering the stench of the city's streets, the labyrinth of intrigues and tongues sharpened like daggers. "Aye, wonders and troubles alike. Keep your wits about you, lad." It was late afternoon when they crested a slight rise, and one of the men pointed. "Look there, my lord," he called. Ned turned, following the man's gaze. On the southern horizon loomed the first sight of the high walls and towers of King's Landing. The city sprawled along the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, with the Red Keep perched upon Aegon's high hill. Smoke rose in hazy columns from countless chimneys, the haze mingling with the low-hanging clouds. Even from this distance, one could sense the sheer size of it. The mass of humanity living within those walls, the mass of wants and schemes and heartbreak. Ned guided his horse forward, feeling a swirl of apprehension. The last time he had come to King's Landing was after Robert's rebellion, to see his friend crowned and to help restore a realm battered by war. Now, he returned under threat of a different kind, threats from both men and monsters. They followed the road toward the city gates, merging with heavier traffic. Wagons laden with goods, farmers leading donkeys, small folk trudging with sacks on their backs, the occasional retinue of lesser lords. At each checkpoint, Goldcloaks stood with spears, eyeing travelers. When Ned's party approached the main gate, the guards stiffened at the sight of so many northern soldiers. "Halt!" barked the sergeant of the watch, stepping forward in his gilded half-helm. "Name yourselves." Ned urged his horse closer. "I am Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell." The sergeant blinked, as if he could hardly believe it. Then his expression hardened. "On what business do you enter the city, my lord?" Ned thought of a dozen possible answers. In the end, he gave the simplest. By the king's command. The guards stood aside. They dared not refuse entrance to the Lord of Winterfell, though Ned noted the tension in their shoulders, the flicker of fear or anger in their eyes. The travelers pressed on, weaving into the city proper. At once, the stench of King's Landing enveloped them. A potent mix of sweat, sewage, smoke, horse dung, and rotting vegetables. For the newly arrived men from the north, it struck like a physical blow. Several wrinkled their noses, glancing about as though expecting to see the source of every foul odor. Even so, the city pulsed with life. Stalls lined the streets, hawking meats, fish, fruit, cloth, and 1,000-odd wares. Street urchins darted between horses. Beggars crouched at corners. The buildings rose in haphazard rows, half-timbered and leaning precariously. Overhead, crows perched on gutters. The cobblestones were slick with the residue of the last rain, causing horses to tread carefully. Ned led his men toward the Red Keep, navigating the narrower streets that twisted uphill. He had to trust his memory of the city's layout, though some corners seemed changed by new structures or collapsed walls. At times, they had to push through milling crowds. Gold cloaks appeared more frequently as they climbed higher, stern-faced. Some recognized the direwolf banner and whispered among themselves. At last, the Red Keep's crimson walls rose before them, perched on Aegon's high hill. The fortress's ramparts overlooked the city, and Ned could see the tall towers that ringed Maegor's holdfast. They approached the main gate, flanked by heavily armed gold cloaks. A captain stepped forth, demanding their names. Ned repeated the introduction. Lord Eddard Stark, come at the king's request. The gold cloaks exchanged uncertain glances. We were told to expect you, my lord, the captain said, though his tone suggested he thought Ned might never appear. You and your men may stable your horses in the outer yard. Then, if you please, my lord, you will follow me. Ned noted the direction. We are to be separated from our horses and weapons, no doubt. It was common protocol, but in these tense times it felt more like mistrust. Still, he nodded. Lead on. They rode into the outer courtyard, where the king's stables lay adjacent to a row of outbuildings. Grooms rushed to take the horses, though they cast wary looks at the northern men. The courtyard bustled with activity. Servants carrying crates, knights leading horses, squires chattering. A dozen gold cloaks kept watch from the parapets above. Ned dismounted with a stiff groan, handing the reins to a wide-eyed groom. Roderick, Jory, and the others did the same, smoothing their cloaks and adjusting their swords. The captain of the gold cloaks inclined his head. The king's waiting in the throne room, my lord. If you'll come with me, I'll show you the way. Your men can remain here or be quartered in the barracks. They're not to roam freely, by the queen's orders. Ned's jaw tensed, but he kept his voice even. Very well. Sir Roderick, see to our men and belongings. Jory with me. Roderick bowed. Aye, my lord. The older knight gathered the rest of the Stark guards to ensure they understood their new quarters. Jory fell in behind Ned, and they followed the captain across the courtyard and into the Red Keep proper. Through tall doors of oak and iron, they entered a winding corridor lit by torches in iron sconces. The walls were thick stone, hung with tapestries depicting Targaryen conquests, remnants of an older time. Their footsteps echoed. The corridor opened into the grand foyer that led to the throne room. Two massive doors stood closed, each carved with the seven-pointed star of the faith. More gold cloaks stood here, and a handful of courtiers milled about, perhaps waiting for audiences. The hush was palpable. A tall man with a fur-trimmed cloak, a noble Ned didn't recognize, shot him a sidelong look of unease. Word had spread. Ned Stark had arrived. The gold cloak captain went to speak with the guards at the door. Ned used the moment to steady himself, his heart thumping dully. He remembered how he had last walked into this throne room after the rebellion, to see Robert crowned. The weight of that memory settled on his shoulders. This time, he came not as a triumphant friend but as a man under suspicion, forced to deliver an unthinkable warning. One of the door guards stepped back, pulling on a lever. The huge doors groaned as they swung open, revealing the vast emptiness of the throne room. Columns marched down the sides, reaching up to a vaulted ceiling. Torches flickered in sconces, casting dancing shadows along the walls. At the far end rose the Iron Throne itself, forged of twisted, jagged swords. Sitting upon it, draped in a fur-trimmed cloak, was King Robert Baratheon. He looked bigger than Ned remembered, both in girth and in the force of his presence. He wore a beard shot with more gray than black these days, and his eyes, once so full of boyish laughter, were hard. Beside the throne stood Queen Cersei, her golden hair carefully arranged, her face a mask of regal calm. Arrayed around them were members of the Kingsguard in white cloaks. Ned glimpsed Ser Jaime Lannister with his customary smirk, Ser Boros Blunt, and two others. To one side, the dwarf Tyrion Lannister stood quietly, hands clasped behind his back, expression unreadable. To the other side, the small council. Grand Maester Pycelle, stoop-shouldered and ancient, Peter Baelish, his mockingbird pin gleaming, and Lord Varys in his voluminous silks, fingers steepled. Trumpets blared, echoing in the high vault. A herald stepped forward, voice ringing out. Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell, Warden of the North, has arrived before the king. Ned advanced across the floor, Jory at his side, footsteps carrying him closer to a confrontation he had dreaded for weeks. He slowed some yards before the throne, kneeling, Jory kneeling behind him. Your Grace, Ned said, voice firm. I come as you commanded. For a moment, the only sound was the low crackle of torches. Then Robert's voice boomed through the hall, though it was more gravelly than Ned recalled. Do you now? The king growled. Took you long enough, old friend. Ned rose to his feet slowly. I had urgent matters in the north that could not be left untended. Robert snorted. And urgent matters here that demanded your presence. Yet you spurned my invitation for weeks. He leaned forward on the Iron Throne, the sword scraping under him. Give me one good reason, Ned, why I shouldn't name you traitor and be done with it. Ned suppressed a flash of anger. The king's words stung like a whip, but he forced himself to remain calm. Because, Your Grace, I serve you faithfully. Always have. I wrote you letters explaining my delay. There is a threat in the north that dwarfs any dispute of men. Robert glanced at Cersei, then back at Ned. Bah! You speak of these phantoms again? The so-called White Walkers. He gave a harsh, disbelieving laugh that echoed down the hall. I recall those tales from the cradle. You claim to have seen them. Ned's jaw tightened. He sensed all eyes upon him. The Queen's cool gaze, Jaime's predatory smirk, Littlefinger's sly curiosity, Varys's masked interest. I saw them, Ned said clearly. I fought one. The others have returned. I would not say it if I were not sure. A murmur rippled through the throne room. Some of the courtiers exchanged worried glances. Others sneered in disbelief. Robert's face grew dark. You expect me to muster my armies and march them north on the word of children's stories? I expect you to trust me, Ned said, keeping his voice level. You are my king. I am your man. I have risked my life beyond the wall and seen what I've seen. Robert's lips curled in a scowl. Your life? You think I haven't risked mine? I fought on the trident for our realm. I slew Rhaegar Targaryen. I bled for my throne. Don't speak to me of trusting men, Ned, when you've refused to come help me govern. Ned's next words were measured. I am here now. I come not to fight but to warn. The Night's Watch is desperate for men and supplies. If the realm is fractured, the Watch will stand alone. The others will sweep down unchecked. He saw a flicker in Robert's eyes, maybe doubt, maybe stubborn denial. Before the king could reply, Cersei's voice cut in, smooth as silk. My dear husband, perhaps you should recall that Jon Arryn also served you faithfully, and look what became of him. She looked at Ned with something bordering on disdain. We are all aware Lord Stark was close to the former hand. Perhaps too close. A hush fell. Ned felt a surge of anger. If you suggest I had anything to do with Jon Arryn's death, Jon Arryn died of a sudden illness, Robert barked, cutting him off. No foul play was proven. Cersei's green eyes flicked with cold amusement. That remains to be seen, does it not? There are many mysteries in King's Landing these days, my lord. People whisper of old secrets, of bastards, of hush-hush inquiries. They say Jon Arryn asked too many questions. Now you bring your own set of claims. A wave of confusion washed over Ned. This was new. What questions had Jon Arryn been asking? Something about bastards? He tried to make sense of it. Before he could speak, Robert slammed a fist on the arm of the throne. Enough! This is not the time for rumors. He glowered at Ned. You say the others are real, that they threaten my kingdom. Fine, I've heard your words. Now hear mine. If you are so convinced, then you will remain in King's Landing as my hand, as Jon Arryn was, so we might get to the bottom of these claims. Will you do that? Or will you run back north again? The question was a hammer blow. Ned's heart pounded. Accepting would mean burying himself in the viper's nest of King's Landing. His family, his home, all left behind. Yet refusing again might provoke Robert to do something reckless, or to dismiss the threat entirely. He glanced at Jory, who looked uneasy. He glanced at the Queen, whose expression was unreadable but for the faint curve at the corner of her lips. Then he looked at Robert, his friend from boyhood, who had changed so much. He took a breath. "If it is your command, your grace," he said quietly, "I will serve." A stir went through the onlookers. Cersei's eyes narrowed in the candlelight. Jaime Lannister crossed his arms, leaning against a column, watching with a faint smirk. Robert nodded, though his expression remained hard. "Good. Then let us speak of how we will defend this kingdom, both from real enemies and imagined." The words were a sneer, but Ned said nothing. He had done what he must. If the realm was to be warned, if there was any hope of uniting the Seven Kingdoms against the White Walkers, he had to be inside the halls of power. He had to do what Jon Arryn had once done, root out truth among a nest of lies. The king turned to a steward. "Prepare chambers for Lord Stark in the Hand's Tower. His men will be quartered in the barracks, or wherever space can be found." He looked back at Ned. "We'll have a council meeting on the morrow. Until then, rest from your journey." A formal dismissal, no offer of a feast or a warm welcome. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste. Ned bowed stiffly. "As you say, your grace." Then he pivoted, Jory at his side, and left the throne room, feeling eyes boring into his back. In the corridor, they were met by a pair of servants who began leading them to the Hand's Tower. Ned could scarcely contain his swirl of thoughts. He had avoided coming south once before. Now, by Robert's decree, he was ensnared in the very place he most dreaded. He turned to Jory. "Collect the men. Inform them we'll be staying. They should be on their best behavior. This court is a pit of snakes." Jory nodded. "Aye, my lord." They wound through the castle's corridors until they arrived at the tower dedicated to the Hand's office and apartments. It was smaller than the royal wing, but still large enough to house a considerable retinue. The servants lit torches along the walls, revealing a modest solar, a dining hall, and a suite of chambers for Ned himself. The rooms smelled stale, as though unused for some weeks. Perhaps Jon Arryn's possessions had been cleared out after his death. Ned felt a pang, recalling the man who had been like a father to both him and Robert. Now Ned was expected to fill Jon's place, in a city that had devoured him. After dismissing the servants, Ned and Jory walked through the rooms, ensuring nothing was amiss. The furniture was well made, the hearth already laid. Ned felt none of the comfort a lord might expect. Weariness tugged at his bones, yet he knew rest would not come easily. A knock at the door drew their attention. Jory opened it, hand on the hilt of his sword, to find a small man with thinning hair and a calculating smile. Peter Baelish, master of coin. "May I come in?" Littlefinger asked in his silken voice. Ned gave a curt nod. Baelish slipped inside, glancing around with a faint grin. "Ah, how good it is to see the Tower of the Hand occupied again. It's been too quiet since Lord Arryn's passing. You've arrived just in time to fill the void." Ned was in no mood for japes. "What do you want, Lord Baelish?" Littlefinger placed a hand over his heart in mock offense. "Only to welcome you to King's Landing, Lord Stark. I'm sure you've had a trying journey. You must be famished." "I've eaten on the road." Baelish's eyes flicked with amusement. "Of course you have. Well, as it happens, I bring an invitation from the Queen." He produced a small parchment. "She requests your presence on the morrow, after the council meeting, for a private audience. She suggests it would be prudent to attend." Ned did not bother hiding his scowl. "The Queen requests a private audience. Any notion of what she wants?" Baelish smirked. "I might hazard a guess or two, but her grace keeps her own counsel." He offered the parchment. Ned took it. "I would advise you accept. One does not lightly refuse the Queen." Ned's fingers tightened around the parchment. "Very well." Baelish inclined his head. "Then I shall inform her grace you are open to her gracious invitation. If you need anything else, my lord, coin for your men, adjustments to the tower staff, my door is always open." He turned to go, but Ned called after him. "One thing, John Arryn. Did you know what questions he was asking before he died?" Littlefinger paused at the threshold, half-turning. "He was a curious man. He spoke to many of us about certain matters, lineages, old records, the backgrounds of squires and the like. I chalked it up to his interest in genealogies. But who can say what truly worried him?" His tone was so casual Ned could not decide if he was lying or telling the truth. "If you learn more, tell me." A faint grin curled Baelish's lips. "I'll keep my ears open, Lord Stark. King's Landing is a city of whispers, after all." Then he slipped out, closing the door softly behind him. For a moment, Ned stood in silence, gazing at the closed door. Jory cleared his throat. "He's an odd one. Dangerous," Ned corrected quietly. "He's the master of coin but deals in secrets, not gold." Jory nodded. "Shall I stand guard tonight, my lord? Have 2 of our men guard this tower entrance in shifts. Trust no one beyond our own." Ned rubbed his eyes. Exhaustion weighed heavily. "We have to be vigilant, Jory. The Queen is cunning, Robert is angry, and the Lannisters smell blood. Meanwhile, the threat beyond the wall grows." They spoke in hushed tones a while longer, discussing how best to arrange their guard rotations. Then Jory left to handle the details, and Ned was alone in the Lord's solar. He stood at the window, gazing out at the city lights below, 1,000 flickering lanterns in the darkness. The wind carried the faint stink of the river and the city's waste. Far beyond, lost in the blackness, lay the broad lands of Westeros, and at its northern edge the wall, where an ancient terror stirred anew. Ned felt as though he stood on a precarious ledge, with storms looming on both sides. But there was no turning back. He would face the court, the king, the queen, all of them, if that was the only path to mustering the realm against the others. He prayed to the old gods that Robert might hear him before it was too late. He prayed that his children in Winterfell would remain safe, that Robb would stand strong. And most of all, he prayed that the White Walkers would not sweep across the north in a tide of icy death before men could set aside their petty squabbles and unite. He extinguished the lamps, ignoring the dryness in his throat, and made for his bed. Sleep would come or it would not. Either way, the morrow would bring fresh battles, battles of words in the council chamber, of hidden knives in the corridors. And in the distance, a far more dire battle was gathering, silent as falling snow, cold as death itself. If he failed here in King's Landing, then all the swords in Westeros might not be enough to hold back the night. Morning came with a pall of cloud and a chill wind off the Blackwater Bay. Ned woke early, washing the road dust from his face in a basin of tepid water. He dressed in plain gray wool and the heavy cloak that bore the direwolf sigil. Jory arrived to escort him to the council meeting. Down the tower's winding stairs they went, through a courtyard where stable hands hurried to feed the horses, then into the corridors leading to the council chambers. They found the council already assembled in a circular room dominated by a long table of polished oak. Robert was there, seated at the head, though his expression was sour. Cersei sat at his right, wearing a green gown that highlighted her golden hair. Littlefinger lounged to one side of the table, drumming his fingers, while Varys looked on with a sweet, unreadable smile. Grand Maester Pycelle dozed, chin to chest, until the door opened. Renly Baratheon, the king's younger brother, stood near a window, gazing out, though he turned at Ned's arrival. Behind them, a few scribes and attendants lingered, quills and parchment in hand. "Lord Stark," Robert said, voice abrupt. "Sit. We have matters to discuss." Ned took a seat. Jory stood behind him, arms folded. Robert wasted no time. "First, the crown's finances," he said, waving a hand toward Littlefinger. "Baelish, tell him." Littlefinger let out a theatrical sigh. "Well, as I've been trying to impress upon our dear king, the realm is deeply in debt. The tournaments and feasts have drained the treasury. We owe a significant sum to the Iron Bank of Bravos, among others." Ned stared, remembering how Robert always loved to feast and joust. "How much?" Littlefinger's eyes glinted. "Close to 6 million gold dragons, my lord. Perhaps more, depending on the interest. We lost track of some sums during Lord Aaron's final days." Ned's stomach twisted. 6 million. How could the realm accrue such a debt? Robert slammed his fist on the table. "Easily, when you have a realm to run and men constantly asking for coin. Wars are expensive, feasts too, and the Iron Throne must maintain appearances." Cersei laid a hand on Robert's arm, as if to calm him. "We'll manage, husband. The Master of Coin has ways to keep the throne afloat." Ned glared at Littlefinger. "Borrowing more to pay old debts is not a solution." Littlefinger shrugged. "It's the solution we have. And you propose more lavish spending, I suppose? Another grand tournament, maybe?" Ned asked, voice laced with sarcasm. Varys interjected smoothly. "We should focus on more pressing issues. A tourney might raise morale, but at what cost? The city is uneasy. Soldiers walk the streets. Tensions rise." Renly nodded. "We have rumors of banditry in the Riverlands, and lords complaining of the Hand's seat being vacant for so long. Now that Lord Stark is here, perhaps we can quell some of that." Ned took a breath. "I'll do what I can," he said, though he wasn't sure how he'd manage anything if Robert ignored the far greater peril. "But finances aside, we must speak of the Night's Watch. They need men and supplies. If the others truly threaten us, we can't leave the watch to fend for itself." A silence fell. Cersei's lips tightened. Robert made a dismissive gesture. "We have problems enough here, Ned. The others, by the gods, why must you cling to that nonsense?" Ned refused to yield. "I have seen them, your grace. They are no children's tale. The Night's Watch is outnumbered and undersupplied. If we do not fortify the wall, the consequences will be disastrous." Robert's face reddened. "And where would you have me find men, or coin, or supplies? We're in debt, or have you forgotten already? Would you have me march my armies north for a threat that might not even exist?" "It does exist," Ned said, a sharp edge creeping into his tone. He could sense the exasperation swirling within him. "Send a delegation of your lords to Castle Black. Let them see the evidence themselves. Otherwise you risk ignoring the greatest danger of our time." Varys cleared his throat delicately. "A delegation might be prudent, if only to quell the rumors. If the others are indeed returned, seeing is believing." Robert scowled, glancing at his queen. Her face was unreadable, but Ned sensed hostility. "Fine," the king growled. "We'll discuss it further. For now, see if the crown can spare men or coin after we settle these debts." He shot Ned a glare. "But don't expect miracles." Ned nodded stiffly. "Thank you, your grace." They moved on to discuss other topics. The region's harvest projections, disputes between minor lords, the management of King's Landing's swelling population. Ned listened, contributed where he could. He noted how Cersei often spoke quietly to Robert, swaying him with subtle suggestions. Littlefinger watched it all with a cat-like grin, occasionally dropping sly remarks. Renly attempted to remain cheerful, but Ned sensed he was frustrated by the squabbling. Pycelle dozed off mid-discussion, only to awaken and mumble platitudes, and Varys, soft-spoken and polite, offered bits of knowledge gleaned from his little birds, as though the entire realm were a puzzle he calmly observed. When at last the meeting ended, Robert pushed back from the table with a grunt. "I've had enough of talk. I need a breath of fresh air and some wine, not necessarily in that order." The others stood. Ned bowed, though his back felt stiff. Robert clapped him on the shoulder with a heavy hand. "We'll speak again soon, old friend. Try not to vanish on me this time." Ned managed a faint smile. "I'll be here, Your Grace." One by one, the council members drifted out. Cersei lingered, exchanging a long glance with Ned that brimmed with challenge. Then she swept from the room, her green skirts trailing. Jory moved to Ned's side. "Are you all right, my lord?" "I'm fine," Ned said quietly, though he felt anything but. "I'll return to the tower. There is much to do." But first, he recalled the Queen's invitation. Perhaps it was better to get that out of the way. He asked one of the servants where he might find the Queen at this hour. The servant bowed and said she would likely be in her solar in Maegor's Holdfast. Ned hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "Jory, wait for me in the courtyard. I'll speak with her grace alone." "My lord," Jory said, concern plain in his eyes, but he did not argue. Ned made his way through a series of corridors and gardens, approaching the secure enclosure of Maegor's Holdfast. Goldcloaks stood guard at a small arched gate, but they stepped aside at his approach. Within, he followed a page who guided him to a pair of ornate doors. The page rapped lightly, then opened one door, announcing, "Lord Stark, Your Grace." Ned stepped inside. The room was richly furnished with Myrish carpets and silk curtains. Sunshine poured through tall windows, glinting off a golden vase filled with winter roses. Cersei stood by a balcony, gazing out over the city. She turned as he entered, letting the page close the door behind him. They were alone, or so it seemed. "My lord Hand," she said, each syllable crisply enunciated. "I'm glad you came." She gestured to a chair. "Sit." Ned hesitated, then remained standing. "You wanted to speak with me, Your Grace?" Her emerald eyes flicked with amusement. "I see your northern bluntness remains intact. Very well. Yes, I wish to speak plainly. You come here prattling about White Walkers, and my husband seems half inclined to humor you. Perhaps you truly believe these old tales. Or perhaps you have another motive." Anger rose in Ned's chest, but he kept his voice controlled. "My only motive is the safety of the realm. You cannot dismiss what I've seen." She stepped closer, the faint scent of lilies wafting from her hair. "Perhaps, but even if these others are real, what then? You would have the realm muster, spend precious coin, divert attention from other matters. My father, Lord Tywin, is not a man who tolerates abrupt shifts in power or finance. Robert's actions affect us all." Ned regarded her coldly. "Are you threatening me, Your Grace?" She smiled, a predatory curve of her lips. "A warning, rather. You have made enemies by ignoring the king's summons, and you shall make more if you insist on pressing for a northern threat that many find ridiculous. I suggest you tread carefully, for the sake of your family, if nothing else." His hands clenched at his sides. "Threatening my family is unwise." She tilted her head, as if amused by his ire. "It's not a threat, simply an observation. You have, what, 2 daughters here in King's Landing? Sansa and Arya, yes? They must be eager to join you and see the marvels of the South. A pity they remain in Winterfell." "Oh, but do they?" For a moment, Ned was confused. Cersei's knowledge seemed imperfect. Sansa and Arya had indeed remained in Winterfell, but only because Ned had refused to bring them previously. Now he was half glad for that choice. At least they were safer in the north, though how safe truly? Cersei continued. "The truth is, Lord Stark, you have placed yourself and your house in peril by sowing the seeds of alarm. Robert might be your friend, but he is still a king who suffers no challenge. My father is the realm's wealthiest lord, and he invests heavily in the Lannister legacy. You know what that means, I trust. Ned's anger warred with the desire to remain calm. He met her gaze unflinchingly. I know House Lannister always pays its debts. I have debts of my own to my people, to protect them from any threat, be it from the north or from you. She laughed softly. Spare me the dramatics. We both know if the king tires of your warnings, he will cast you aside. I advise you to mind the game you're playing. This city can be more treacherous than any northern snowscape. He gave her a curt bow. If that is all, your grace, I have duties to attend to. She studied his face a moment longer, as though weighing him. Then she waved a dismissive hand. Go then. I trust we understand each other. You are here to serve the king. If your talk of mythical monsters disrupts the crown's interests, you will find little mercy. Ned said nothing more. He turned and strode to the door, each step resonating with the tension in his chest. He did not glance back. Only when he was in the corridor, the door closed behind him, did he exhale a shaky breath. The queen was every inch as dangerous as he'd feared. She might well do anything to protect her power, and Robert, for all his bluster, was in her thrall at times, or simply too tired to resist her manipulations. He found Jory in the courtyard, along with a few Stark guards who waited anxiously. Jory's gaze asked silent questions. Ned shook his head to indicate nothing good had come of the meeting. Let's return to the tower, he said. We have much to plan, if we're to survive this city. They walked away from Maegor's holdfast, crossing the yard under the midday sun. Ned couldn't help glancing up at the towers, picturing the labyrinth of passageways within, the secrets behind each door. Jon Arryn had died here, possibly because of secrets he uncovered. Now Ned found himself treading a similar path. Meanwhile, the true danger, the White Walkers, remained far beyond the wall, stirring in the cold darkness, while the realm's great lords squabbled over coins and crowns. He resolved that he would not let the court's intrigue bury the truth. One way or another, he would make them see the threat. Yet each step felt heavier than the last, as though a shadow loomed over him, a shadow that reached from the far north all the way to this den of ambition and pride. In his mind's eye, he saw again the image of a gaunt, icy face and eyes like blue stars. He saw armies of the dead marching south across frozen fields, unstoppable, while men in warm halls called him a fool. No matter how the queen threatened, no matter how Robert raged, Ned Stark knew his course was set. He had knelt at the foot of the Iron Throne, but in truth, the realm itself was in service to a greater fear. Winter was coming, and with it came the others, a tide of darkness older than memory. The question was whether anyone would heed him before that darkness spilled over the wall and drowned them all. He could only hope, and in the Red Keep, hope was a precarious thing indeed. Ned Stark returned to the Tower of the Hand in a cloud of silent fury. Every corridor in the Red Keep felt too narrow, each guard's gaze too watchful, each step echoing a reminder that this was no haven but an adversary's ground. Cersei's soft-voiced threats still rang in his ears. She had not minced words. The power of House Lannister was poised to crush any challenge to the crown's authority, no matter how grave the northern danger. She had managed, in the span of a few minutes, to convey a single harrowing message. Tread carefully, or your family will pay the price. Within the tower, Ned found Jory Castle and two other Stark guards, Hullen and Martin, posting themselves in a small antechamber near the main stairs. They were speaking in low voices, taking stock of the men who had accompanied them to King's Landing. At the sight of Ned, Jory inclined his head and stepped forward, concern lining his brow. "My lord, everything well?" he asked quietly. Ned managed a nod, though a sour taste lingered in his mouth. "As well as can be expected. The Queen wanted me to know precisely where I stand." He paused, lowering his voice. "I need you and the others to be even more cautious than we'd planned. Post guards at each entrance to the tower. No one enters these rooms without my leave." Jory exchanged a worried glance with Hullen and Martin. "It shall be done, my lord." "Good," Ned said. "I have matters to tend to. See that I'm not disturbed unless absolutely necessary." He climbed the stairs alone, boots scraping on the worn steps. The corridor at the top curved past a row of windows that overlooked the city. Ned paused to glance outside. The sun had reached midday, casting a sullen light over the countless rooftops and smoky chimneys. From up here, King's Landing looked like a mosaic of red tiles and crooked alleyways, teeming with throngs of people who had no notion of ancient evils stirring in the far north. It was a place of day-to-day struggles, bread and coin, petty rivalries, gossip about lords and ladies. And beneath it all, the Lannisters moved like great golden lions, ready to pounce the instant Ned's warnings became inconvenient. He found his solar empty, as he had asked for privacy. Dust motes danced in the pale sunbeams that knifed through tall windows. 2 wooden chairs, a large table, shelves lined with dusty ledgers, Jon Arryn's old workplace. The ghosts of the former hand seemed to linger in the hush. Ned paced a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. Beyond the Queen's threat, 2 urgent goals clamored in his mind. First, he must press the crown to address the dire threat of the White Walkers. He could not let Robert brush it aside again. Second, he needed to learn more about Jon Arryn's final inquiries. There was a reason the old hand had delved into lineages and bastardy rumors, and Cersei's pointed mention of questions made Ned suspect it was no coincidence. If something about the royal succession, or the Queen's own secrets, had led to Jon Arryn's death, that same secret might imperil the realm's unity just when it most needed to stand together. He turned to a large wooden chest that stood near the shelves. When Ned had arrived, servants had told him it contained some of Lord Arryn's papers and books that had yet to be removed. He crouched, unlatched the lid, and began to rummage. Inside lay several old tomes on Westerosi history and genealogies, exactly the sort of volumes rumor said Jon Arryn had been studying. One thick book's spine bore the title, The Lineages and Histories of the Great Houses of the Seven Kingdoms. Ned lifted it out, testing its weight in his hands. The cover was scuffed, but the pages still had that faint odor of parchment and dust. Could this be what Jon Arryn had been poring over in his final days? He set it on the table, scanning the contents. Lists of houses, their marriages, their children, their bloodlines, branching back centuries. A labyrinth of births and betrothals. Why would Jon Arryn have been so intent on this volume? Ned turned page after page, scanning for something that might catch his eye. Baratheons of Storm's End, Targaryens, Lannisters, Starks, Arryns. He found no obvious annotations, no markings to indicate interest. The dryness of the text nearly lulled him into frustration. He made himself keep looking. Eventually, on one page near the middle, he noticed a slight smudge, as if someone's fingertip had lingered there. He peered closer. It referred to the Baratheon lineage. The text described the traits typical of Lord Orys Baratheon's line, from dark hair to strong jaw, a passing mention of black hair recurring in Baratheons for generations. It also listed a handful of outliers, but the consistent theme was black of hair, brown or blue of eye, large of build. Ned stared at the words, then exhaled slowly. Jon Arryn had evidently paid special attention to the details of House Baratheon's signature look. In that moment, Ned remembered the rumor that Jon Arryn had visited a boy named Gendry, a bastard rumored to be Robert's get, shortly before falling ill. Gendry had the Baratheon look, by all accounts. The puzzle pieces began to arrange themselves in Ned's mind, though not yet forming a complete picture. Why fixate on Robert's bastards? Because the legitimate heirs. Ned frowned. Prince Joffrey, Princess Myrcella, and Prince Tommen all had golden hair, like Lannisters. None of them bore the black of House Baratheon. Not one. Was that what Jon Arryn discovered? The notion hit Ned like a hammer blow, so savage that his breath caught. If Robert's so-called heirs were not truly his, if Cersei's children were fathered by someone else, Jaime Lannister almost certainly, then the entire line of succession was a lie. And if that knowledge had gotten Jon Arryn killed, it would be no wonder the Queen was desperate to silence any further curiosity. He closed the book, a chill crawling up his spine. If Prince Joffrey was not Robert's son, he had no claim to the Iron Throne. That would mean the line of Baratheon truly rested with whomever was the next legitimate heir, Stannis Baratheon or Renly Baratheon. Such knowledge could tear the realm apart in a succession crisis. And if the realm fractured, the White Walkers would find easy pickings. Ned rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of a secret that could topple crowns. A soft knock came at the door, stirring him from the tumult of his thoughts. He slid the book onto a shelf out of immediate sight. "Come," Ned called. The door opened to admit Maester Pycelle, stooped and wheezing, his maester's chain clinking softly. "Lord Hand," he said, voice quavering. "I trust one do not disturb you?" Ned forced himself to maintain composure. "Not at all, Grand Maester." He motioned to the chair across from him. "Sit." Pycelle lowered himself onto the chair with an effortful groan, adjusting his chain. "Forgive an old man's infirmities. I thought it best to call upon you. We, on the council, are eager to know your intentions." The king seemed uneasy after this morning's session. "We rarely see him so riled." Ned offered a slight nod. "I'm sure he has much on his mind." Yes, indeed," Pycelle said. "We all do, I suppose. This matter of the Night's Watch troubling, yet many remain unconvinced. Some whisper you use it to distract from the crown's debts, or from whatever you learned beyond the wall. I do not share such suspicions, of course," he added hastily. "I merely pass along the murmurs." Ned studied the old man's features. Pycelle had served under the Targaryens for decades, then under Robert. He had a reputation for serving whichever king wore the crown. "I'm not surprised. The truth is often overshadowed by rumor in this city." "Quite so," Pycelle said, stroking his long white beard. "But I came to mention another matter. The late Lord Arryn. He consulted with me in his final weeks. He complained of seeing puzzles everywhere. But he did not share them in detail, nor did I pry. Then he fell ill so suddenly." The maester's tone turned grave. "I did all I could. Yet the poison, the illness was swift." Ned caught the slip. Poison? Or was it truly a slip? Pycelle's watery eyes flicked aside as though nervous. "You believe he was murdered, Grand Maester?" The old man hesitated. "I do not know. I saw no proof. There were no suspicious powders, nor any sign of a poison well known to maesters. But men speak of the tears of Lys, the strangler, many vile substances. Some are near undetectable. It pains me to think such a thing might have happened under my watch." He sighed. "At times, I wonder if I failed him." Ned reached for a measure of gentleness in his voice. "You did all you could, I'm sure." Yes, Pycelle muttered. "Well, if I can aid you in any inquiry regarding Lord Arryn's final days, do not hesitate to ask. I serve the crown, of course, but I also serve the realm. The Hand's investigations are hardly outside my purview." He rose, leaning heavily on a carved cane. "I take my leave, my lord." As Pycelle hobbled away, Ned couldn't help but sense that the man knew more than he revealed. Perhaps he suspected murder but dared not confirm it. In King's Landing, knowledge was a currency that one hoarded carefully. Ned gave a curt bow and watched him go. When the door clicked shut, the Solar felt emptier than ever. Moments later, Jory reappeared, stepping inside with a purposeful stride. "My lord," he said in a low voice, "there's a boy here, Will from the Night's Watch, the messenger we brought with us. He's in a state. Says he's had trouble with gold cloaks outside the tower." Ned frowned. "Send him in." Will entered, hood pulled low, his breath ragged. "My lord," he began, bobbing an awkward bow. "Apologies for disturbing you. I tried to deliver letters to certain lords of the small council, as the Lord Commander commanded me. But gold cloaks stopped me in the yard, searched my satchel, demanded to know who I was. They nearly took my letters. I had to slip away." Ned's eyes darkened with anger. "They tried to seize the Watch's messages?" "Aye, my lord." Will's hands trembled. "I'm worried the Queen's men want to intercept any request for aid from the Watch." Ned had no doubt they did. He placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "You did right coming to me. From now on, I'll see to it that your letters are delivered under my seal. The Night's Watch is sworn to the realm, not to any single house or faction. No one has the right to confiscate your messages. We'll let out a shaky breath. Thank you, my lord. I have letters for the king and some for the Master of Laws, Lord Renly, is it? There's also one for the Master of Ships, Lord Stannis Baratheon. He paused uneasily. But Lord Stannis left the city some time ago. Some say he's gone to Dragonstone. Ned nodded. He'd heard the same. Stannis's abrupt departure from court had caused murmurs. Robert had not elaborated, but men whispered that Stannis was are over some dispute or rift. Another wedge driven into the Baratheon family, at a time the realm could ill afford it. We can still forward the letter to Dragonstone. We'll see if the king's messenger service can be trusted, or if I should send one of my own men to carry it directly. Thank you, my lord, Will repeated, relief in his voice. I only wish the rest of the realm believed me when I say the watch needs help. Too many think it's an old man's tale. Ned gave him a sad smile. They'll believe or they'll perish. Let us hope we can open their eyes before it's too late. For now, stay close to the tower. You'll be safe under House Stark's protection. Will bowed and departed. Ned caught Jory's grave expression. This is how it begins, Ned said quietly. The crown obstructing vital information out of paranoia or politics. Aye, my lord. Jory paused. That boy's letters may be our best chance to show proof that the Night's Watch truly begs for men. If the Goldcloaks are interfering, it's likely at the Queen's behest. She might fear you'll convince Robert to shift the realm's coin from Lannister debts to the Watch's needs. Ned pinched the bridge of his nose, as though trying to ward off a headache. So many obstacles, so little time, and a secret that could shatter the realm. He didn't elaborate on that last part, but felt it pounding in his mind. If Robert had no trueborn heirs, the entire kingdom could splinter under a succession crisis, just as a far more terrible war loomed in the north. He could not let that happen. Yet if he confronted Robert or the Queen with the truth without proof, all he'd achieve was the immediate wrath of House Lannister. And if they realized he was close to revealing the children's parentage, they might strike first, as they had with Jon Arryn. Ned had no illusions that Cersei would balk at murder if it preserved her children's claims. He turned to Jory. I'm going out. Jory gave him a startled look. Where to, my lord? The Queen might have watchers posted. I suspect she does. Nevertheless, I must find certain people, witnesses to Lord Arryn's last inquiries. If we are to root out the cause of his death, we need to speak with them quietly. Jory straightened, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. I'll come with you. We can bring half a dozen men. Ned shook his head. No, a larger group will draw too much attention. You, me, and one other should suffice. Choose a man who can ride well and keep silent. We'll go as any 3 riders might, with no sigils on our cloaks. Jory hesitated but finally nodded. As you say. They left soon after, wearing plain gray cloaks, hoods drawn low. Ned took a simple breastplate rather than the heavier armor that would mark him as a high lord. Jory and Martin joined him. They slipped out a postern gate, ignoring curious glances from a pair of Goldcloaks stationed there. Once beyond the Red Keep's walls, they wended through the cluttered streets, horses picking their way over cobblestones and muddy patches alike. Ned guided them north, past market squares and narrow alleys choked with stalls. The city was a jostle of noise. Hawkers crying wares, dogs barking, children darting underfoot. The smell of fish stews and rancid refuse thick in the damp air. More than once, they had to edge aside for a lumbering ox cart or a train of mules. Overhead, crows perched on signposts, cawing. It was a far cry from the quiet snows of Winterfell. Jory edged closer as they rode. Where to first, my lord? Ned had made inquiries of his own, gleaning that Jon Arryn had visited a certain armorer in the city named Tobo Mott, one who had occasionally been commissioned by the Red Keep for fine steel. Word was that Arryn had come to ask about a certain apprentice. Tobo Mott's shop, Ned answered. He's near the Street of Steel, if I recall. They found the place in the long shadow of a row of smithies. Smoke belched from forges all along that street, the clang of hammers forming a discordant chorus. Tobo Mott's establishment was larger and better maintained than most. He was famed for superior workmanship. They dismounted in a small courtyard, tying their horses to an iron post. Ned could feel the heat radiating from the forge even before they entered. Within, the air shimmered with warmth, and the smell of hot steel and cinder hung thick. A muscular apprentice was hammering on a glowing blade, while Tobo Mott himself stood by, shouting corrections. Mott turned as Ned's group entered, wiping sweat from his brow furrowing at the sight of 3 strangers in traveling cloaks. "Be with you shortly," the master armorer called, stepping away from the apprentice. As he approached, he noticed the hint of wealth in Ned's bearing, and his posture became a touch more deferential. "How may I help you?" Ned offered a polite nod. "Master Mott, is it? I've heard much of your skill." "I am." But the armorer's eyes flicked to the sword at Ned's hip, then to Jory's stance, the subtle markers of men accustomed to better steel. "You're from the castle," Mott said, an edge of caution in his voice. Ned saw no reason to lie outright. I serve the king's hand. We've come on a matter of curiosity. Word is the late Lord Arryn visited you not long before he took ill." Mott's expression tightened. "He did. And he asked after one of your apprentices, I believe? A boy named Gendry." Tobo Mott's lips parted, and for a moment, he looked ready to deny everything. Then his shoulders slumped. He asked many questions. About the boy's parentage. About how he came to me. He cast a glance to the corner of the forge, where Gendry might be, but only the older apprentice stood there, continuing to hammer. "Gendry's not here at the moment. I sent him out on an errand." Ned nodded, quietly relieved that the boy was alive and well. "Then perhaps you can tell us what you told Lord Arryn." Mott stepped closer, voice hushed. "I told him Gendry never knew his mother. A blonde whore, so the story goes, or so the gold paid for his keep. But the gold was good, and the bag bore the stag sigil. So I took the boy in. I'm not in the habit of trifling with lords, my lord." Ned noted the detail about the sigil. A crowned stag, the symbol of House Baratheon. Precisely what he'd suspected. "Lord Arryn pressed you for more?" "Aye. He wanted to see Gendry himself. Looked at him from head to toe, asked questions about his age, his color of hair, black as coal and those strong features. Then he thanked me and left." The armorer's eyes darted about nervously. "I told the boy to keep his head down. I have no love for meddling in High Lord's affairs." Ned inclined his head in sympathy. "You did what you had to. We won't trouble you further, unless we might speak with Gendry." Mott nodded reluctantly. "He'll be back by sundown. If you wish to wait, that won't be necessary. Thank you for your honesty." Ned paused, thinking. If certain men come asking about the boy, do him a kindness. Advise him to be wary. There's more at stake than you know. Tobo Mott swallowed. "Ah, yes, my lord. I'll see him safe." Ned left with Jory and Martin, stepping outside into the bustle of the Street of Steel. The clangor of other smithies assaulted them, and the late afternoon sun fell on Ned's shoulders like a heavy hand. He drew a measured breath. That had confirmed everything. Gendry was one of Robert's bastards, plainly bearing Baratheon traits. Jon Arryn had discovered it, too, evidently as part of an investigation into the royal children. That knowledge, or some piece of it, had led to his death. He shared these thoughts with Jory and Martin as they reclaimed their horses and rode away from the Street of Steel. "If the Queen's children are not Robert's," Ned murmured, "then House Lannister's hold on the throne is founded on a lie." Jon Arryn realized. Now he is dead. Jory's face darkened. "If they suspect you know, my lord." Ned nodded grimly. "Yes, that is why we must tread lightly, until we are sure how to best proceed. If the realm learns the king's heirs are false, war would erupt overnight. But if they truly are false," Martin said, "then how can you keep it hidden?" Ned blew out a breath, guiding his horse around a group of ragged children who ran giggling through the street. "I don't know. To remain silent dooms the realm under a false king when Robert dies. But to speak might unleash war with the Lannisters, just as the others gather in the north. We cannot afford a civil war. Jory spoke in a low hush. We might bring the truth to Robert quietly, with no one else present. He is your friend. He was my friend, Ned corrected, glancing toward the city's sprawl. Now, I'm not certain if anything remains of that old bond. He drowned himself in wine and anger long ago. The Queen manipulates him, and if I accuse her of treason, she'll not stand idle. The Lannisters would move swiftly, perhaps even kill the king to control Joffrey's claim. Then the North would face the combined might of the Crown and the gold of Casterly Rock. Ned grimaced. All while the White Walkers stir. The timing could not be worse. They made their way back toward the Red Keep, crossing the busy main thoroughfares. Vendors cried out from stalls selling fruit, roasted nuts, cheap ale. Seagulls wheeled overhead, drifting inland from Blackwater Bay. The tang of salt in the air was faint but present. Ned saw lines of ragged smallfolk waiting outside a building with a sigil of the Crown above it. Likely a place that distributed bread or rice as part of the Hands Relief programs begun under John Arryn. The line was far too long, and the guards looked weary. Another sign that the city was swollen with refugees or drifters, some fleeing banditry in the outlying regions. Tensions simmered everywhere, waiting only for a spark. That spark might come from the Lannisters, or from some new revelation about the heir, or from the White Walkers if men remained blind. They passed into the Red Keep with little trouble, though the Goldcloaks eyed them suspiciously. Once in the tower, Ned took a moment to collect himself in his solar. He removed his cloak, washing his hands in a basin of water that had gone tepid. On the table, the genealogical tome still lay where he had stowed it. Every time he glanced at it, the enormity of the crisis came rushing back. "We should speak to Renly Baratheon," Ned said to Jory. "If Robert's next brother, Stannis, is in Dragonstone, then the younger brother is here. Renly must at least suspect something about Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen. Their hair is as fair as the Lannisters. No hint of the Baratheon look. John Arryn may have confided in him." "He's on the small council, my lord," Jory said. "But does he stand with the Lannisters or with the king?" Ned sighed. "That is what I must find out." Before he could move, a soft knock sounded. He motioned for Jory to see who it was. Jory opened the door a crack, then admitted a slender man with sharp features and a mockingbird pin on his collar. Peter Baelish. Littlefinger inclined his head in a theatrical bow. "My dear Lord Hand, are you avoiding me?" Ned straightened. "I've had pressing tasks." "I'm sure you have. I hear you've been writing about the city incognito." "Goodness. Rumors travel quickly here." His smile was razor-thin. "If you were seeking information, you need only ask your master of coin. I have ways of knowing things." Ned regarded him warily. "Do you indeed?" Littlefinger tapped the side of his nose. "You might be surprised how many tongues wag when properly tickled with coin. And I suspect you might find certain tongues beneficial to your investigations. One, in particular, a certain boy who saw Lord Arryn frequently in his last days. A messenger in the Red Keep stables, so I'm told. Shall I arrange a meeting?" Ned studied the man's face, searching for the trap. Baelish gave him that perpetual half-smile. He might indeed have a stable boy who overheard something about Arryn, or he might be baiting Ned for secrets. Still, the lead was too tempting to ignore. "That would be helpful," Ned said slowly. "Why would you do this, Lord Baelish?" Littlefinger's eyes glinted. "Because the realm thrives on a stable hand, and because knowledge is my currency. Perhaps you'll find that your gratitude may serve me later, or perhaps I simply enjoy meddling. Does it matter?" Ned did not trust him, but he could not reject the offer outright. "Arrange it, then." Baelish dipped his head. "Very good. I'll send word when I have him." He looked around, feigning interest in the walls. "I see Lord Arryn left a few trifles behind. Such a pity his tenure ended in tragedy. Still, you must find it bracing to sit in that seat, yes? Knowing how the last man died." Ned bristled. What's your point? Only that you must watch each step, Littlefinger said with a shrug. No one wishes to see you share Lord Aaron's fate, least of all me. I find you far more interesting alive. He turned to go, then paused, throwing a final glance over his shoulder. Oh, I almost forgot. The king is hosting a feast in the Great Hall tonight, a small affair. He did not specifically say you must attend, but let us say it would be noticed if you do not. Ned nodded stiffly. I understand. Littlefinger departed, leaving an unsettling hush behind. Jory let out a low breath. He's a sly one. A viper, Ned agreed. But for now, we'll hear him out if it means learning more about Jon Arryn's last days. He moved to the window, gazing at the watery light over the courtyard. And tonight, I must attend the king's feast. Jory gave a respectful inclination of his head. I'll have your best doublet readied. Night fell like a soft curtain over King's Landing, but the Red Keep was anything but quiet. Torchlights blazed in the courtyard, servants rushing about to prepare the great hall. Minstrels arrived with flutes and lutes, while knights in polished armor entered in pairs or small retinues. Word of a small feast had clearly grown as rumors spread. Many lords and ladies in the city seemed intent on appearing. Feasts were Robert's preferred pastime, after all, and no one wanted to offend the king by snubbing his invitation. Ned stood before a polished metal mirror in the tower, letting a servant finish adjusting the fastenings on a dark gray doublet embroidered with the Stark sigil. He felt as though he were bracing for a battlefield, rather than a feast. Cersei would be there, no doubt. Jaime Lannister as well. The thought of them made his stomach clench. The only solace was that they would not dare strike openly in so public a setting. He took a moment to look at the reflection. Lines of worry marked his face more deeply than they had a year ago. The North's troubles, the White Walkers, the possibility of a realm-breaking secret. It was all carved into the tension in his eyes. He sighed and turned away, letting the servant finish with a final tug on his cloak. Downstairs, Jory waited, wearing a simpler outfit but one neat enough for a formal gathering. All's arranged, my lord. Our men remain posted at the tower. They'll keep watch on our quarters. Should trouble arise, we'll know. Ned clapped him on the shoulder in thanks. They set off through the castle's dim corridors, the torchlight dancing across stone walls. From every side, echoes of voices floated as courtiers and minor lords made their way to the great hall. Servants bustled with trays of sweetmeats, pitchers of wine, and bowls of fragrant stew. The air smelled of roasted meats, fresh bread, and too many perfumes. 2 red-liveried guards flanked the great hall's tall doors, along with a pair of gold cloaks. They nodded Ned through. Inside, the hall was already crowded. A sea of faces, many of whom turned at once, parting for the hand of the king. Ned glimpsed a dais at the far end where Robert sat, flanked by the queen on one side and a pair of King's Guard on the other. Musicians were setting up on a small platform. Tables for the guests were arranged in rows. Servants hurried to place dishes of poached fish, honeyed fruits, spiced wine, and more. Robert caught sight of Ned, beckoning him forward with a broad wave. "Ned!" he bellowed across the hall, voice booming. "Come and sit up here where I can see you, damn it." Ned forced a polite smile and wove through the throng, noticing how men stepped aside with a mix of deference and curiosity. He wore no illusions. Many here likely whispered behind their hands about his northern fantasies. But Robert's call left him no choice. He ascended the few steps to the dais and bowed. The Iron Throne was not present. This was the king's feasting seat, a simpler but still ornate chair placed at a long high table. Queen Cersei sat in a gilded seat next to him, her green gown shimmering in the torchlight. Jaime Lannister and Ser Boros Blunt stood guard behind them in their white cloaks. Varys and Littlefinger sat a bit further down, each with a goblet of wine. Grand Maester Pycelle dozed, of course, while a bored-looking Renly Baratheon occupied another seat. A place remained open, presumably for Ned. "Your Grace," Ned greeted, giving another brief bow. "Sit, sit." Robert looked flush with drink already, a half-empty flagon of wine at hand. I was telling Cersei here about that time we rode together on the Trident. Remember that, Ned? The charges, the roars, the blood. I remember, Ned said quietly, lowering himself into the empty seat. A servant poured him wine. He barely sipped it, alert to every flicker of expression on Cersei's face. She nodded curtly to him, lips pressed tight. "We are honored you could join us, Lord Hand." He returned a polite dip of the head. "I serve at the king's pleasure." "Indeed," she replied coolly, turning her attention back to Robert. The king barked out a laugh at some private joke and reached for a leg of roast boar on the platter before him. Ned exhaled, turning to greet Renly on his left. "Lord Renly," he said, voice subdued. "It's good to see you." Renly gave a courteous smile. "And you, Lord Stark. We've missed your presence at court these past weeks." Ned gave a faint shrug. "I had to see to matters in the north." "Ah yes, those are rumors." Renly's tone was guarded. He glanced at Robert, who had begun retelling a bawdy story involving tavern girls and the biggest bed in the Seven Kingdoms. Cersei looked distinctly unamused. "Shall we speak more privately, Lord Stark?" Ned recognized an opening. "I'd like that very much. Later, then," Renly murmured, leaning away as a servant set a tray of spiced duck before them. They could not talk freely with the queen and half the court listening in. Meanwhile, the hall grew louder with the clink of cups, the scrape of knives on plates. Music began. A sprightly tune that soared over the general din. Robert roared for more wine, ignoring his half-eaten boar leg in favor of a fresh cup. The guests below the dais seemed content to let the king make noise, though Ned noted a few anxious glances from the more sober lords. The realm's finances were dire, and the talk of potential conflict with the North or the Lannisters left them uneasy. Cersei sipped delicately at a glass of Arbor Gold, her gaze roaming the crowd. Her eyes flicked across Ned once or twice, but she said little. Jaime Lannister, standing behind her, wore a faint, lazy smile, golden hair gleaming like coin. He looked more bored than concerned. Ned forced down some bites of duck and bread, feigning participation. He had little appetite, given the swirl of possibilities in his head. He reminded himself, "You are here to keep up appearances, to gauge the court's mood, not to pick fights." Partway through the feast, Robert lurched to his feet, startling everyone. He raised his wine cup high. "A toast," he boomed, "to my loyal friend, Ned Stark, who has finally deigned to join me in the city after chasing shadows in the snow." He let out a loud laugh, half sincere, half mocking. Some in the hall laughed along, though uncertainly. Ned stood as well, forced to accept Robert's show. He managed a tight smile. "To the king," he replied, raising his own cup. The tension in his chest was a coil. He drank a small sip, while Robert drained his cup in 2 great gulps. Around them, the feast resumed with forced cheer. Minstrels struck up another tune. Dancers took the floor, spinning in bright silks. Servants replaced empty platters with fresh steaming meats, kidney pie, roasted capons, gravy-laden beef. The wine never stopped flowing. Ned found himself mired in conversation with Pycelle, who woke from his doze long enough to drone on about the majesty of the realm's traditions and how the small council labored tirelessly to keep everything running. Ned nodded politely, not believing half of it. At length, Renly Baratheon leaned over again. "Lord Stark," he said in a low voice, "if you'll excuse yourself, we might walk in the gallery. The air is thick in here. I'll join you shortly." Ned caught his meaning. "Of course." He made his apologies, stepping away from the table. Jory, standing off to one side, made to follow, but Ned waved him back. "Stay here," he said under his breath. "No need to rouse suspicion. I won't be long." Jory reluctantly nodded, and Ned wove his way off the dais. A few heads turned as he left, but no one detained him. He exited through a side door that led to a covered arcade overlooking one of the castle's inner courtyards. The night was cool, a faint breeze rustling the potted plants lined against the arches. Torch scones provided flickering light, and Ned felt a surge of relief to be out of the great, suffocating hall. Moments later, Renly appeared, glancing over his shoulder to be sure they were alone. "Lord Stark," he greeted with a short bow. "Forgive the secrecy, but as you say, there are too many ears in that hall. You wish to speak with me?" Ned measured him a moment. Renly was the youngest Baratheon brother, slim, handsome, dark-haired, but with none of Robert's boisterous heft. He wore a green doublet trimmed in gold. The crowned stag sigil worked upon his breast. His manner was charming, at times frivolous. Yet Ned knew he was no fool. Ned said quietly, "I want to ask about your brother, Lord Stannis, and about the late Lord Aaron." A flicker crossed Renly's face. "Stannis left the city abruptly, just after Lord Aaron died. He wouldn't say why. I suspect he suspected something. But you'd have to ask him. And Lord Aaron? Well, I know that in his final days, he came to me once, asking about Robert's bastards. He said the word openly, looking Ned in the eye. He wanted to confirm how many of them existed in the city, or if I knew anything else about the lineage of the king's children." Ned's pulse quickened. "You suspected he was investigating the royal children?" Renly crossed his arms. "I suspected, but he never told me outright. He only asked strange questions about bloodlines, about hair color. At the time, I thought it was an old man's fancy. Then, suddenly, Lord Aaron was dead, and Stannis sailed to Dragonstone. He left not a word behind. When I tried to speak to him, he brushed me off." Ned sighed. "Why do you think Stannis left? Was he afraid? Or planning something?" A wry look crossed Renly's face. "Stannis never admits fear, but he is cautious and bull-headed. If he believed the Queen was behind Lord Aaron's death, perhaps he thought he might be next. Or perhaps he planned to gather loyal men on Dragonstone, in case a storm broke." Renly paused, glancing down the torchlit arcade. "You think Lord Aaron discovered that Robert's heirs are not his?" The bluntness gave Ned pause. "I think it likely. Their features, they do not match Robert's line." Renly let out a tense breath. "Then you realize what that means?" Ned nodded. "A war for succession if it becomes known. If Robert died suddenly, Cersei would place Joffrey on the throne, Lannisters at his side, and anyone who protested would be branded a traitor. Which includes me," Renly said softly. "I'm Robert's brother, by all rights. If those children are not Robert's blood, then the next rightful heir is Stannis or me." He gave a mirthless smile. "But I have no illusions about the Lannisters letting any of us claim the throne. They'd spill blood in the streets first." Ned stared at the flicker of torchlight on the polished stone. "We cannot let that happen. The realm faces a far graver danger in the north. We must not tear ourselves apart." Renly studied him, brow creased. "Your talk of White Walkers, is it truly so dire?" Ned set his jaw, remembering the pale shapes in the snowy wood. "It is. The others are no myth. If the realm does not unite, we'll be overrun. I came here to beg for the king's aid in fortifying the wall, but if war erupts in the south, that cause is lost." Renly blew out a breath. "All the more reason to ensure a smooth succession, I suppose. But do you see Robert listening? He'll trust the Queen's sweet words before he trusts reason. And if you tell him his children aren't his," he grimaced, "men have been murdered for less." Ned's shoulders tightened. "Yet we can't do nothing. Let me speak to him quietly, with proof. If he believes me, we might proceed carefully. Send for Stannis. Settle the question of succession without open war. If the Queen doesn't learn of it first." Renly frowned, glancing at the sky. Stars were faint above, obscured by the city's glow. "A dangerous game, Lord Stark. You'd better move quickly. The Queen is cunning, and if she suspects you intend to reveal her secret, she'll strike preemptively." Ned nodded. "I'm aware. I only hope Robert can be persuaded to act discreetly." A thoughtful silence fell. Renly finally said, "For my part, I'll do what I can to keep the peace, if you keep me informed. Should worst come to worst, I'll gather those I trust. But I pray it doesn't come to that. The realm can't afford another war. Agreed, Ned said quietly. Thank you, Lord Renly. Renly gave a short bow. We should return before our absence is noted. Take care, Lord Stark. He turned and strode back into the castle, leaving Ned alone in the arcade, the night breeze brushing against his face. Ned lingered a moment, letting the hush soothe his nerves. He remembered the smell of pine and snow outside Winterfell, the call of a distant direwolf in the dark. This city felt like another world, with trouble in every corner. The secret of Joffrey's parentage was the spark that could ignite a wildfire. And far north, the others were a cold doom waiting to sweep across unsuspecting men. It would take every ounce of cunning to prevent catastrophe. He could almost feel the walls closing in. The Queen's threats, Robert's temper, the Lannisters' readiness for violence. He turned back inside, returning to the Great Hall. The music was louder now, the dancers spinning in faster circles. Robert was in his cups, face flushed red, regaling Jaime Lannister with some tale of old battles. Jaime smirked, replying with a witty retort that made Robert burst into raucous laughter. Cersei stood from the dais, perhaps bored or irritated, and swept from the hall with two ladies trailing her. Ned noted how the Queen didn't even glance his way. That in itself felt ominous. He resumed his seat. The rest of the feast passed in a blur of faces and forced pleasantries. Pycelle dozed again. Littlefinger raised a mocking toast in Ned's direction. Varys approached to purr some ambiguous words about the realm's delicate stability. At one point, Robert tried to coax Ned into sharing a story of the rebellion, but Ned deflected with a half-smile, claiming weariness. At last, near midnight, the king declared the feast done, lurching to his feet, calling for more wine as he stumbled away to his quarters. Servants hurried to tidy the hall, extinguishing torches in the corners. Ned left quickly, collecting Jory. They navigated the corridors back to the tower, passing clusters of men-at-arms and ladies who lingered to gossip. By the time they reached the Tower of the Hand, Ned felt drained in body and spirit. He parted from Jory near his solar. "Have the men stand watch," Ned said. "No one enters unannounced." Jory bowed and went to relay orders. Ned entered his chambers, quietly shutting the door. It was dark, the only light a single lantern left by some thoughtful servant. He shrugged off his heavy cloak and doublet. Then he paused, eyes settling on the genealogical tome he'd laid on the table. Its pages filled with century after century of births, marriages, house sigils. So many legacies, so many lines of blood. And now that he knew the truth of Cersei's children, those lines threatened to tear the Seven Kingdoms apart. He settled into a chair, weariness pressing down. He could almost hear Jon Arryn's voice whispering from the grave. The seed is strong. A simple observation about House Baratheon's black-haired blood. But it meant everything. It meant Joffrey's claim was a lie. Jon Arryn had died for it. Stannis had fled for it. And now Ned Stark stood balanced on the edge of a knife, with the entire realm's fate in the balance. Caught between false heirs, a volatile king, and an ancient enemy creeping from the north. A soft rap at the door jolted him from his reverie. Ned stood, heart quickening. Who would come at such an hour? He crossed to the door, half expecting one of his guards, or perhaps a messenger. He opened it a crack. To his surprise, the dwarf Tyrion Lannister stood there, arms folded, dressed plainly in dark leather. Two Stark guards hovered behind him, tense. "Lord Stark," Tyrion said in a low, even tone. "May I have a word?" Ned's mind raced. Tyrion was known for cunning, for a quick tongue. He was also the Queen's brother, though disliked by his sister, rumor said. This was unexpected. Ned glanced at the guards. "He's unarmed." The nearest guard nodded. "We searched him, my lord. He's carrying no blade." Tyrion gave a brittle smile. "I seldom carry one. Steel is often less sharp than a well-chosen word. Will you let me in, or shall we discuss matters in the hallway?" Ned hesitated, then stood aside. "Very well, but keep your voice low." He motioned the guards away, and Tyrion slipped inside. Ned shut the door, facing the dwarf in the lantern's glow. "To what do I owe this late visit?" Tyrion glanced around, eyes flicking over the genealogical tome, the austere furniture. "I've just returned from a brief trip to, well, never mind that. I learned of some rumors in the city. Rumors that you, my lord, are investigating matters best left alone." Ned's jaw tightened. What matters would those be? Jon Arryn's death, for one. And now you're rumored to be dabbling in the bastards of the city. People whisper you're collecting them like shells on a beach. Tyrion cocked his head. That's a bold approach in a place as dangerous as King's Landing. Ned felt his pulse thrumming. "Is this your way of warning me off? Or threatening me on your family's behalf?" Tyrion's mouth curved in a sardonic smile. "I've not much love for my sister, nor for my dear nephew Joffrey, if I'm honest. I have no interest in seeing King's Landing drenched in blood. I only want you to understand that Cersei's secrets, if indeed they are what you suspect, are not trifles. If you push her, she will push back. Hard." Ned's gaze hardened. "I know." A slight nod from the dwarf. "Perhaps you do. Then you'll know that you need allies, strong ones. Men who stand for the realm, not for gold. Or for vanity." Ned frowned, searching Tyrion's face. "Are you offering yourself as an ally?" Tyrion let out a short laugh. "Gods, no. I'm a Lannister and you're a Stark. Our families have never been close. But we share this, I think. Neither of us wants the kingdom to tear itself apart. And both of us suspect that if the wrong people learn your truth, there will be war." Ned exhaled softly. "Then you've come to dissuade me from telling Robert?" "On the contrary," Tyrion said, stepping closer, voice nearly a whisper. "If you have proof, and if you think Robert will handle it wisely, by all means, share it with him. But do it in a way that leaves Cersei no opening to strike first. Because she will strike, given the slightest whiff of your intentions. She might kill Robert, kill you, kill anyone who stands in her path. The question is, do you trust Robert not to bellow your findings to the entire court in a drunken rage?" Ned's shoulders slumped a fraction. That precisely was the rub. Robert had become so volatile, so loud. Could he keep such a secret until the realm was ready for the upheaval it would bring? "I don't know," Ned admitted quietly. Tyrion's eyes shone with a strangely sincere gleam. "Then be certain before you commit to a course. I've heard talk of troubles in the north. The others, or so men say. You cannot fight two wars at once, my lord. Win the game here in the south, or at least keep it from igniting, then turn your gaze north. Otherwise, the entire realm goes up in flames and ice." Ned studied him, torn between distrust and a grudging respect for the dwarf's bluntness. "Why tell me this?" Tyrion's shrug was slight. "Maybe I prefer a realm that still exists a year from now. Maybe I enjoy confounding my family's expectations. Maybe I owe you a sliver of a debt for the courtesy you once showed me at Winterfell." He waved a hand. "Take your pick." Silence hung. Outside, Ned could hear the faint footsteps of a guard pacing, the distant echo of voices from far corridors. Tyrion Lannister's gaze did not waver. At last, Ned cleared his throat. "If I do nothing, the Queen's false heirs stand. If I reveal all recklessly, war erupts. My only hope is to show Robert the truth quietly, persuade him to handle it discreetly. But I must also muster support for the Watch." Tyrion inclined his head. "And so your tightrope walk continues. Well, I won't keep you longer. I only advise caution, Lord Stark." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "One last thing. If, by chance, your northern threat is real, you'll need the Lannisters' gold and men as much as anyone else's. Remember that." Then he was gone, the door shutting behind him with a soft click. Ned stood in the lantern light, heart thumping, thoughts in turmoil. How had it come to this that Tyrion Lannister seemed more reasonable than the king himself? Yet he could not ignore the dwarf's words. Every part of Ned's plan, every step, was a pitfall waiting to swallow him. Eventually, he sank onto a bench, leaning against the table. The genealogical tome sat there, inert yet charged with meaning. That single line, "The seed is strong, was like a prophecy no one could escape. If only Robert had not drowned his best self in wine and regrets. If only the Queen were not so ruthless. If only the White Walkers were not gathering in the frigid wastes, hungry for the living. But if only changed nothing. Dawn would come soon enough. Ned would have to keep pushing, for the sake of Winterfell, the North, and indeed all Westeros. The next step, dangerous as it was, might be to confront Robert in private. To beg him for secrecy until they had a plan. Perhaps to call Stannis back to the capital quietly, or gather certain loyal lords who would not cower before the Lannisters. That was the only way. Yet even the best-laid plan could crumble if Robert roared the truth after too many cups of wine. Or if Cersei caught wind of the meeting and preempted it with her own savage brand of cunning. Ned closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe evenly. The White Walkers. He remembered the swirl of snow in the haunted forest, the silent approach of those tall, pale shapes. No matter the cost, the realm had to unite. He opened his eyes, steeling himself. He was Eddard Stark of Winterfell, Warden of the North, now Hand of the King. He would not falter, but he had never felt so alone or so uncertain. He rose, doused the lantern, and moved to his bed. Sleep came in ragged fragments, haunted by dreams of frozen battlefields and crows tearing at corpses with Lannister golden hair. In the darkness, he prayed to the old gods for guidance, and for enough time to see this through before winter fell on them all. The next day dawned with a crisp wind that carried the tang of salt from Blackwater Bay. Ned rose early, washed, and dressed in a simpler tunic, intending to visit the Master of Arms. If he was to remain in King's Landing, he might as well keep his sword arm practiced. But before he could leave the tower, one of his guards knocked, announcing that Lord Baelish waited below. Ned sighed and told the guard to bring him. Peter Baelish strode in, impeccably groomed. "My dear Lord Hand," he said cheerfully. Busy day. I trust you slept well after last night's revels." Ned forced polite indifference. "What is it, Lord Baelish?" "I've arranged the meeting we discussed, the stable boy who once served John Arryn. He's willing to talk, though I had to promise a few coins to keep him from vanishing." Ned nodded, remembering that Baelish had hinted at such a lead. "And where is this boy?" Baelish's smile broadened. "Down by the royal stables, naturally. I told him we'd come this morning. Shall we depart? Or do you have other pressing business first?" Ned eyed him warily, but he could not deny his curiosity. "Let's go." He summoned Jory. Together, the three men walked out of the tower and through the Red Keep's courtyard, heading toward the stables near the castle's southeastern wall. Jory kept a watchful eye for trouble. They saw a few gold cloaks, but none seemed overly interested. The day was bright, the sky swept free of clouds. Stable hands bustled about, feeding horses, mucking stalls. Near the far end of the stables, Baelish gestured to a youth perched on a bale of hay, chewing idly on a straw. He was thin, with lank brown hair, perhaps 14 or 15. At the sight of the approaching lords, he scrambled to his feet, eyes flicking nervously between them. Baelish turned to Ned with a flourish of his hand. "This is Jax, formerly in service to Lord Arryn as a runner. He carried messages around the keep. Jax, this is the Hand of the King. Speak up, boy." Jax swallowed hard. "My lord," he stammered, bowing clumsily. "I heard you wanted to know about Lord Arryn." Ned kept his tone gentle. "I do. I understand you often ran errands for him." "I sometimes. He was a good man, if you ask me." Jax fidgeted with his straw. "He came to the stables to see a certain book, a big black book with gold corners. Or no, wait, that was something else. Actually, it was—" "Slowly," Ned interjected. "You're safe here. Just tell us what you recall." The boy took a breath. "He used to come talk to a certain horsekeeper who's in charge of the king's private stables. Once or twice, I saw him speak to the master of horse about the prince's mounts. I only overheard bits, something about color, about breeding, about the color of the horses sired by certain stallions." He glanced up, eyes darting. "It sounded strange, my lord, like he was asking which colt came from which line. Then he'd compare it to the color of the colt's coat. Ned exchanged a look with Jory. Horse colors, another piece of the puzzle. Jon Arryn had realized that Baratheon blood manifested strongly. Black hair in the Cheel, Dren, or in the colts. If a Baratheon fathered children, they'd show the black or brown traits. If the children had Lannister gold, that told its own story. Did Lord Arryn say anything else? About the prince? Jack scratched his neck. He asked if Prince Joffrey ever came to ride, if he had a black horse. The stablemaster said no. Prince Joffrey's mount was a golden palfrey from Lord Tywin's stables, and Prince Tommen's pony had golden brown coloring. The same was said of Princess Myrcella's mare. He paused, gaze flicking from Ned to Baelish. Lord Arryn seemed troubled. He muttered something like, "The seed is strong, except here." Then he asked me to fetch the royal genealogies from the library. I never did, though, because 2 days later he was sick. That's all I know, my lord. Ned suppressed a chill. You did well. He slipped the boy a small coin purse. Use this for a better life than mucking stalls. And if anyone asks you about Lord Arryn, mention not a word. Understood. Jax clutched the coins gratefully, nodding fervently. Yes, my lord. Thank you. He scampered off, leaving Ned alone with Baelish and Jory. Baelish shrugged. Not exactly a grand revelation, but it aligns with what you already suspected. Does it not? Ned's face was grim. It does. He exhaled. Thank you, Lord Baelish, for arranging this. Littlefinger gave a shallow bow. Ever at your service. Do try to avoid getting yourself killed, Lord Stark. The city would be so much more boring without you. With that, he strolled off, humming a jaunty tune, leaving Ned and Jory standing among the horses. The smells of hay, manure, and leather enveloped them. Ned rubbed his eyes. Jon Arryn must have realized the prince's traits didn't match Robert's bloodline. Horses, children, it's all the same principle of inheritance. And for that knowledge, he was slain. Then we must act soon, Jory said quietly. Every day we wait is a day the Queen might sense your intentions. Ned nodded. I know. I'll request a private audience with Robert, somewhere away from the Red Keep. Perhaps we can ride out to the Kingswood together, as we once did, under the pretense of hunting. He might be more open there. Jory's look spoke volumes. It was a risk, but Ned saw no other choice. He had to make Robert see the truth without the entire court listening. They left the stables in tense silence, returning to the Tower of the Hand. Along the way, Ned's thoughts strayed again to the far north. If the realm fractured over succession, the White Walkers would roll down over a kingdom too divided to mount a defense. He remembered the vision of those blue eyes, the crack of ice against steel. If Robert refused to heed him after learning of Cersei's secret, it might be the realm's doom. Yet if Ned forced the truth to light, a war might begin that would equally doom them all. He tried to bolster himself. Somewhere in all this, a path must exist that avoided catastrophe. But each step in King's Landing felt like tiptoeing around a pit of vipers. Cersei might kill Robert at any moment if she felt cornered. Tywin Lannister might march from the west, or the Goldcloaks might seize Ned if he was declared a traitor. In the background, the Crown's debt to the Iron Bank loomed, threatening to sink them deeper into chaos. And beyond it all, winter crept closer. That night, after sending out a discreet note requesting Robert's presence for a private hunting excursion, Ned lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought of Catelyn, Robb, and his daughters, safe in Winterfell. He wondered if they truly were safe. If the others advanced, Winterfell might be the first major castle in their path. The memory of that battle beyond the wall still haunted him. White Walkers slicing men apart with swords of ice, silent and relentless. In the crypt-like hush of his chamber, Ned nearly imagined he could hear the wind that blew across those frozen wastes. He whispered a prayer to the old gods to grant him the wisdom to guide the realm. Come morning, a raven awaited him with a short reply from the king. Robert would ride with Ned into the Kingswood in 2 days' time, to hunt boar. No mention of any retinue. A good sign. Perhaps Robert meant to speak alone. Or perhaps the queen was behind it, planning a trap. Ned tried to push the suspicion aside. He had no other way to speak with Robert out of her earshot. 2 days. That was all the time left before they either set a path to save the realm or plunged it into war. Those 2 days felt interminable. Ned spent them tying up loose ends. Then remain close, but let me go on with Robert alone. If anything happens, do what you must. The plan was thin, but it was all they had. They rode out at sunrise, crossing the thronged city streets before they grew too crowded. At the main gate, Robert's party awaited, about 10 men, among them a pair of huntsmen, a kennel master with dogs, and 2 gold cloaks for courtesy. Robert himself sat astride a massive black stallion, clad in heavy hunting leathers. A boar spear was strapped to his saddle. Ned noticed Jaime Lannister was not present. A small mercy. Robert greeted Ned with a curt nod. "You're on time, at least. Good. Let's be off." His voice carried the remnants of last night's ale, but he seemed sober enough. Ned nodded to Jory, who backed away to wait at a respectful distance. Then Ned joined the King's group, and they trotted out onto the King's Road. The hounds barked, straining at their leashes. The men-at-arms chatted quietly. Robert rode in silence, expression closed. The morning air was cool but promised warmth later, with the sun already climbing above the horizon. They turned off the main road soon enough, heading into the shadowy trails of the Kingswood. The forest closed around them, oaks and ash, tangled undergrowth. Sunbeams filtered through branches, catching motes of dust in the air. The hounds took the lead, sniffing for scent. Robert gestured for the huntsman to press on ahead, leaving him with Ned at the rear. The gold cloaks followed at a short distance. When the huntsmen were out of earshot, Robert spoke gruffly. "You insisted on this hunt. Let's hear it, Ned. What's so blasted important that you couldn't speak in the Red Keep?" Ned took a calming breath. This was it. "My lord, I've discovered a secret, a dangerous one, tied to Lord Aaron's death." He glanced at the gold cloaks behind them. "I beg you, let us speak alone." Robert frowned, turning in his saddle to bark at the gold cloaks. "Hold back 100 paces. I'd have words with my hand in private." The guards hesitated, but Robert's glare brooked no argument. They slowed their horses until they fell well behind, out of earshot. Now only the hush of the forest accompanied them, broken by the distant baying of hounds. "Speak," Robert growled, gripping his reins tightly. Ned steeled himself. Jon Arryn was killed because he learned a truth that threatened the queen and her family. A truth about the royal children. Robert's brow furrowed, though he kept his eyes on the trail. The royal children? Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen? What nonsense is this? Ned forced each word past the tightness in his throat. "They are not your children, Robert. They were sired by Jaime Lannister. All 3. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the creak of saddle leather. Then Robert yanked his horse to a halt, turning on Ned with a face contorted by fury and disbelief. "You dare speak that filth?" He half raised his hand as though to strike Ned, but stayed it. "Are you mad?" Ned held his ground. "I wish I were. I have proof, genealogies, the consistent trait of Baratheon black hair in every known bastard of yours. Yet Joffrey and the others have the golden hair of the Lannisters. Lord Arryn investigated it, and he was murdered for it." Robert's chest heaved. Anger and shock warred on his face. "Golden hair? You claim that's proof? My father's mother had golden hair. There could be 1,000 reasons. None that hold," Ned said, voice low. "You have more bastards in this city than you know, all with your dark hair, your build. I've seen at least one. Jon Arryn found more. Not a single one came out golden. If the gods themselves told me otherwise, I wouldn't believe it. The seed is strong, except in your so-called heirs." Robert's horse stomped, picking up on its rider's agitation. Robert's face flushed purple. "By the gods, Ned, you're telling me my wife bedded her brother, that my son is not mine? Do you hear how mad that sounds?" "I do," Ned said. "Yet it is the truth. Look at Joffrey, truly look at him. and recall how no child of yours, bastard or true, has ever shown anything but dark hair." He swallowed. Jon Arryn's last words were, "The seed is strong." A tremor racked Robert's frame. He let out a ragged breath, reining in his mount with shaking hands. "Cersei," he muttered, voice thick with rage. "All the times she scorned me, refused my bed. She was bedding Jaime? Gods, how many fools does that make me? What am I to do with this?" Ned kept his voice steady. "You are the king, Robert. Only you can decide how to proceed. But keep your voice down, I beg you. If she learns you know, she may strike first, as she did with Lord Arryn. You must act carefully." Robert gave a harsh laugh. "Careful? Ha! She has made a mockery of me and my line. I should kill them all, her brother, those false children. By the gods, I'll—" "Stop," Ned said, seizing Robert's arm. "Killing them would plunge the realm into war with the Lannisters. Tywin would not stand by. Thousands could die. And we have the White Walkers to worry about in the north. A united realm is our only hope." Robert jerked his arm free. "You speak of unity when I've been cuckolded before the entire realm? She brought me nothing but shame. And that boy, Joffrey, he's no son of mine. I'll see him thrown down from the throne if it kills me." Ned's heart pounded. This was exactly what he'd feared. Robert's raw fury unleashed, no sense of subtlety. "Please, Robert, think. If you put the queen to the sword, the Lannisters will rise, half the realm will take sides, and everything we have built will burn. You must handle this with cunning, or the others will find us weak." Robert glowered at him, eyes ablaze, but a flicker of reason crept in. "The others, your northern ghosts. Gods help me, Ned, if even half of that is true, we can't afford a civil war. But I cannot let this pass. She spat on my honor." Ned could almost taste the swirl of emotions radiating from the king. Shame, betrayal, anger, fear for the realm. Slowly, Ned let go of the breath he'd been holding. "I know, there must be justice for her treason, but done in a way that secures the realm. We must gather loyal lords who will side with you. Bring Stannis here with his men, or call upon those not beholden to the Lannisters. Then confront her, force her to yield. If she refuses, we handle it with minimal bloodshed." Robert spat. "Stannis, that dour fool. Yet he's the rightful heir if none of my children are mine." Ned nodded. "Yes, by all laws of the realm, the throne would pass to Stannis if you were to die. But you are not dying, Robert. You are king. We need your leadership to keep the realm from collapse." Robert turned away, staring at the forest canopy overhead. After a long silence, he spoke in a hoarse voice. "I want them brought to me, Cersei, Jaime, the children. I want them locked in a tower until I decide their fate." His gloved hand tightened on the reins until the leather creaked. "But not yet. You're right. We must gather strength, keep it secret. By the gods, Ned, I never thought she'd do this to me. When I think of my sweet Lyanna, how I've yearned all these years, I should have known better than to expect a Lannister to be faithful." Ned's chest clenched at the mention of Lyanna. Once again that old wound. But he said nothing. He simply let Robert breathe through his pain. At last, the king shook himself, a snarl twisting his lips. "I'll play the game, Ned, for now. But soon they will answer for this. And by all the gods, if they resist, I'll have their heads." Ned only nodded, relief and dread mingling in his gut. He had done it, revealed the truth. Now they stood on the knife's edge, where one slip could mean war. If Robert could indeed keep it quiet until they had a plan, the realm might still be saved from chaos. But how to manage that with Robert's infamous temper? And if Cersei discovered the king knew? Hoofbeats approached from behind, and Ned glanced back. One of the gold cloak huntsmen trotted closer, calling out that the dogs had found boar tracks. Robert composed himself with visible effort, forcing a rough grin. "Ah, yes, we hunt boar," he muttered. "Very well, let us kill something." Then, to Ned, he murmured in a voice almost broken, "Soon we'll talk more. I'll not forget what you told me." They rode on, rejoining the huntsman. The morning's tension weighed heavy. They spent hours chasing after the boar's trail, the hounds baying, Robert occasionally bellowing curses when the beast eluded them. Ned watched the king's face for any sign that he might lash out or reveal the secret in a drunken boast. But Robert kept silent, eyes dark with anger. Twice they came close to catching the boar, only for it to vanish into denser undergrowth. By midday, they were all exhausted, overheated in their hunting leathers, and in no mood for further pursuit. The Goldcloaks suggested a rest, but Robert snapped at them to press on. At last, near a muddy clearing deep in the Kingswood, they cornered the boar, a great tusked beast with bristly hide. Robert dismounted, determined to face it with spear in hand. Ned felt his stomach twist. This was the moment in any hunt when an unsteady spear thrust could lead to grave injury. But Robert had done this 100 times before. He advanced on the boar, roaring a challenge. The boar pawed the ground, then charged. Robert lunged, spear braced. The tip caught the boar's flank, but not deeply enough. The boar squealed in fury, swerving to gore Robert's thigh with a slice of its tusk. Robert let out a harsh cry, stumbling, but he swung again, burying the spear deeper. The beast collapsed, kicking up dirt and leaves, blood spurting. The hounds barked wildly, and the huntsman rushed forward. Ned jumped from his horse, heart hammering. He found Robert on one knee, face twisted in pain, blood streaming from a tear in his leather breeches. "Damn beast!" the king growled, half laughing despite the grimace. "Lucky strike." Ned knelt beside him, pressing a hand to the wound. It was bad, blood pulsing hot. "We must bind this." The Goldcloaks scrambled to bring cloth. One had a rudimentary knowledge of battlefield dressings. They wrapped Robert's thigh while he gritted his teeth, refusing to cry out. The huntsman looked on, uncertain, exchanging fearful glances. A boar's tusk could be deadly if it tore an artery or led to infection. Ned thought of the old rumor that a drunken king might one day be undone by a boar. Was this chance, or had the gods intervened? "Help me up," Robert growled. Ned and 2 guards heaved him to his feet. Robert wobbled, leaning on Ned's shoulder. "We ride back. No, we'll go to that old hunting lodge. It's closer than the city. I'll not limp into the Red Keep stinking of pig's blood." A huntsman nodded. "Aye, your grace. Just a league north. We can carry you if you—" "I can ride," Robert snapped. They fetched Robert's horse, and with much wincing and swearing, the king hauled himself into the saddle. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage, but the flow had slowed. Ned stayed close, one hand on the reins, guiding them out of the thick undergrowth. The boar's carcass was left behind for the hounds to savage. No one had the presence of mind to claim it. The men were too worried about their wounded king. Eventually, they reached the old lodge, a modest stone structure with a stable and a few rooms. It was used occasionally by the king or high lords on extended hunts. A caretaker emerged, startled to see Robert in such a state. They cleared a bed for him, built up the fire, and sent a rider to King's Landing for a maester. Robert sagged onto the bed, soaked in sweat. Ned knelt to check the bandage. The gash was deep, but not as high as the artery in the groin. With proper care, Robert should survive unless infection set in. The caretaker brought clean linen and boiled water. Ned and the Goldcloak huntsman, who claimed some skill with wounds, carefully cleaned and rewrapped the leg. Robert hissed and cursed in agony. At last, the bandage was secure. Robert lay back, pale and trembling, breath ragged. "I feel like half a man," he muttered through clenched teeth. "But I'll not be undone by a pig. Not me." Ned forced a reassuring tone. "The maester will be here soon, your grace. You'll mend." Robert closed his eyes, sweat beading his brow. The boar was big, a worthy foe. I would have ended him in one thrust if I had my full strength. He looked up at Ned, eyes flickering. "You've put me in a dark mood, Ned, with your words about the queen. And now I'm laid low. The realm depends on me. Gods be good." "You'll recover," Ned insisted softly. "Rest. Then we'll see to the rest." Robert's gaze focused on him, a flicker of fear behind the pain. Keep it secret. For now. What you told me. Keep it between us until I say otherwise. Or the realm goes up in flames. His hand tightened on Ned's wrist. Promise me, Ned. I can't face her wrath in this state. Tywin would come with an army if she calls. Ned nodded solemnly, feeling pity and frustration in equal measure. I promise. I'll keep your secret. But we must act soon, or she might make her own move. Robert closed his eyes, chest rising and falling. I soon. For now I'll rest. Ned stood, letting him slip into an uneasy sleep. The caretaker hovered, and the gold cloaks exchanged worried murmurs. They all knew the king's life hung on a fine thread if fever took hold. Ned paced the small lodge's main room, heart heavy. He had convinced Robert of the truth, only for a boar to nearly kill the king before he could act. If Robert died here, worthless as it was to a chance boar's tusk, the realm would fall into chaos and war, with Joffrey the immediate claimant, and the Lannisters behind him. All while the White Walkers tend. Ned clenched his fists. Please, old gods, he whispered. Don't let him die. If Robert lingered here, injured, powerless, how long before Cersei sensed something was amiss? She would not wait idly. She would move to secure Joffrey's claim to seize the city. They needed a plan and reinforcements. Ned had no illusions that he could hold King's Landing against the Lannisters with only his own men if it came to open confrontation. He needed time. Time that was slipping away with every drop of blood that stained Robert's bandages. He drifted back into the bedchamber to check on the king, mindful not to wake him. Ned clenched his fists. Please, old gods, he whispered. Don't let him die. If Robert lingered here, injured, powerless, how long before Cersei sensed something was amiss? She would not wait idly. She would move to secure Joffrey's claim to seize the city. They needed a plan and reinforcements. Ned had no illusions that he could hold King's Landing against the Lannisters with only his own men if it came to open confrontation. He needed time. Time that was slipping away with every drop of blood that stained Robert's bandages. He drifted back into the bedchamber to check on the king, mindful not to wake him. Robert's breathing was uneven, his face drawn. In the flicker of lamplight, Ned almost thought he saw the shadow of some irony. The man who had survived the rebellion, the man who had beaten Rhaegar Targaryen upon the trident, now felled by a boar's tusk in a hunt. All the might of his warhammer and his regal power meant nothing against chance and gravity. Ned hovered at his side, silent, reflecting on the vow he had just made, to keep quiet. If he kept that secret and Robert died, the kingdom would fall to Joffrey. If he betrayed that promise, Robert might awaken to a realm already aflame. The noose around them tightened, and in the far north, the White Walkers waited with endless